My name is Adriana Hayes. Last Thursday, I sat in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the San Francisco Bay and watched my siblings become multimillionaires. My brother Julian leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a platinum pen against his chin, as the lawyer transferred $4 million and a lucrative tech portfolio into his name. My sister Sienna adjusted her designer sunglasses and checked her reflection in her phone screen while signing the deed to a $3 million estate in Malibu. Then the lawyer slid a thin, yellowed envelope across the mahogany table to me. I opened it. There was no check inside. There was no deed. There was just a single faded piece of paper with a 10-digit phone number written in my grandmother's tight, slanted handwriting. Julian leaned over, caught a glimpse of the paper, and laughed, a sharp echoing sound that filled the sterile room. "It must be a financial literacy hotline," he said, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "Grandma always worried about your little gardening hobby." Sienna giggled, the sound light and hollow. "Maybe they can teach you how to save up for a new truck," she added. The lawyer said nothing. He just watched me. Everyone in that room looked at me like I was the punchline to a long, exhausting joke. The dirt-stained disappointment of the Hayes family. They had their millions, and they had their proof that Grandma Evelyn saw me the exact same way they did. Worthless. But they did not know Evelyn Hayes. My grandmother did not do accidents, and she did not do jokes. Before I tell you what happened, when I sat in my beat-up Ford and dialed that number, if you enjoy stories where the truth hits harder than a gavel, hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. I always read them. Now let me take you back to the morning of the will reading, 2 days after we buried the only woman in this family who ever looked me in the eye. The day started with the coastal fog rolling thick over my nursery in Carmel. I run a botanical restoration business. I spend my days up to my elbows in soil propagating native California species and restoring cliffside ecosystems. It is quiet, honest work, the kind of work that leaves dirt under your fingernails. In my family, dirt is a sin unless it is being dug up on a rival CEO. My mother, Patricia, called me at dawn. She did not say hello. She just said, "Do not embarrass us today, Adriana. Wear a structured blazer, no denim. We are meeting at Montgomery Street at noon." She hung up before I could reply. The drive up the Pacific Coast Highway gave me time to think. The ocean crashed against the cliffs, relentless and indifferent. My family operated the same way. Evelyn Hayes built her empire in mid-century commercial real estate, ruthlessly buying and holding prime California land when everyone else was selling. She was a woman made of iron and sharp angles. When her health began to fail 3 years ago, the family treated her like a stock that was about to plummet. Julian was too busy securing seed funding for his startup to visit her. Sienna claimed the fluorescent lighting in the hospital gave her migraines, disrupting her content schedule. My mother hired a team of private nurses so she would not have to deal with the messy reality of physical decline. I was the only one who drove up the coast every weekend. I sat by her bed. I read her the Financial Times when her vision blurred. I brought her cuttings from the nursery, letting the smell of damp earth and pine fill her sterile room. We did not talk about feelings. We talked about roots. How deep they go, how they hold the soil together when the storms come. She would grip my hand with surprising strength and tell me to watch the people who only show up when the harvest is ready. By the time I parked my truck in the underground garage of the financial district, I was already exhausted. The elevator ride up to the 42nd floor made my ears pop. The reception area of the law firm smelled like floor wax and old money. Julian was already there, pacing the marble floor, a Bluetooth earpiece tucked into his ear. He was 35, the founder of a Silicon Valley data analytics startup, and carried himself like he was constantly 2 seconds away from ringing the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. He looked me up and down, taking in my plain navy slacks and flat shoes. "You could have run an iron over that shirt," he muttered, not looking away from his phone screen. Sienna arrived 10 minutes late, trailing a cloud of expensive perfume and an assistant carrying her iced matcha. She is 33, a Los Angeles-based lifestyle influencer whose entire brand is built on presenting a flawless, curated existence. She air-kissed Julian and barely nodded in my direction. Our mother sat in the corner clutching a leather handbag like a shield, nodding approvingly at Sienna's outfit. We were ushered into the conference room. The view of the bay was staggering, the Golden Gate Bridge slicing through the fog, but nobody looked out the window. We were all staring at the thick leather folders on the long table. The estate attorney, a man named Richard, who had handled Evelyn's affairs for 2 decades, cleared his throat and opened the proceedings. Richard opened the first folder. To Julian Hayes, he read, "Evelyn leaves the sum of $4 million in liquid assets alongside the managing portfolio of her Silicon Valley commercial holdings." Julian nodded, a tight, satisfied smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. It was exactly what he needed. His startup had been burning through cash, a fact he tried very hard to hide at family dinners, but that showed in the tight lines around his eyes. He leaned back, the picture of a self-made man who had just been handed his safety net. Richard turned the page. To Sienna Hayes, the deed to the Malibu beachfront property, clear of all mortgages, plus a cash sum of $3 million. Sienna let out a breathy sigh, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. She had been eyeing that property for a year, desperate for a physical backdrop to elevate her online brand to the next tier of luxury. She leaned over and whispered to our mother, "I already have the interior designer booked. We can tear out the east wall for better natural light." Patricia smiled, patting Sienna's hand. Then Richard closed the heavy folders. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single, unsealed yellow envelope. He slid it across the polished wood. The friction of the paper against the table was the only sound in the room. It stopped right in front of me. To Adriana Hayes, Richard said, his voice stripped of all inflection. One item of personal correspondence. The room went silent. Even Julian stopped tapping his pen. I picked up the envelope. The paper was textured, aged, unlike the crisp legal documents handed to my siblings. I opened the flap and slid out the single sheet of paper. There was no letterhead, no legal jargon, just a 10-digit phone number written in dark blue ink. Underneath it, 2 words, "Call it." I stared at the numbers. Julian leaned across the table, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read the paper in my hands. When he saw the short string of numbers, the tension left his shoulders. He let out that sharp bark of a laugh. "A phone number," he said, shaking his head. "A phone number." He looked at Richard. "Is that it? No hidden trust fund? No secret real estate portfolio that concludes the distribution of assets," Richard said calmly. Sienna picked up her iced matcha, the ice clinking loudly against the glass. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "Grandma always said you needed to figure out your own life, Adriana. I guess this is her way of pushing you out of the nest. You really should use that number. It is probably a career counselor. Or a shelter." My mother sighed, rubbing her temples as if my mere presence was causing a migraine. "Let us not make a scene. Adriana, if you need help covering your rent this month, Julian and Sienna can perhaps offer a small loan. Now that they have their inheritances, we can afford to be charitable." They were so comfortable in their cruelty. They had spent their entire lives treating me like the strange girl who preferred soil to social climbing. To them, this envelope was the ultimate validation. Evelyn had seen my lack of ambition and rewarded it with nothing. I folded the paper, slipped it back into the envelope, and stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I looked at Julian, whose smirk was cemented on his face, and Sienna, who was already texting someone about her new Malibu house. "Congratulations on your windfalls," I said. I pushed my chair in and walked out of the conference room. I felt their eyes on my back, heavy with dismissal. I did not wait for the elevator. I took the stairs down 2 flights before catching another car, needing the physical movement to ground myself. I walked out into the parking garage. The air down there was cool and smelled like damp concrete and exhaust. I got into my Ford pickup. The seat was worn, the dashboard dusted with potting soil from a delivery I made earlier that week. I locked the doors and sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The silence of the garage pressed in on me. I pulled the yellow envelope from my pocket. My grandmother was a lot of things, but she was not cruel without a purpose. She built an empire by seeing the things other people ignored. She watched Julian beg for seed money, promising returns he could never guarantee. She watched Sienna stage photos in borrowed clothes, pretending to own a life she was desperate to afford. She watched me drive 3 hours every Sunday to bring her fresh pine and sit in the quiet with her. Call it. I picked up my phone. My hands were steady. I dialed the 10 digits. I did not know what area code it was. It did not matter. The line rang once, twice, then a click. A man answered. His voice was crisp, professional, and devoid of the empty warmth you hear from customer service representatives. "Hello," I said. "My name is Adriana Hayes." The man took a breath. The sound of a page turning echoed faintly through the receiver. "I have been waiting for your call, Air," he said. The voice on the other end of the line was calm and measured. It did not hold the rushed, polished tone of the corporate lawyers I had just left behind in San Francisco. "My name is Elias Cole," the man said. "I am a private wealth manager. Your grandmother retained my services outside of her primary firm 7 years ago. I handle the assets she preferred to keep out of the public eye." I sat in the driver's seat of my truck watching a tech executive in a tailored suit yell into his phone across the parking garage. I pressed the receiver tighter against my ear. "Assets," I repeated. "Richard just distributed the assets. Richard distributed the bait." Elias Cole replied smoothly. "Evelyn left specific instructions regarding the envelope in your possession. We need to meet. Not in San Francisco. My office is in Palo Alto. I have cleared my afternoon schedule for you. Come now." He gave me an address and ended the call. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged onto Highway 280, heading south toward Silicon Valley. The drive took an hour, giving me time to process the conversation. My grandmother had always operated on multiple levels. While my mother obsessed over country club memberships and my siblings chased digital clout, Evelyn was a phantom in the boardroom. She built her wealth by outsmarting people who underestimated her. She clearly had one final lesson to teach, and I was the only one holding the textbook. The address Elias gave me did not belong to a glass tower on Sand Hill Road. It was an unmarked single-story brick building tucked behind a row of ancient oak trees. There was no company logo on the door. I parked my dusty Ford next to a sleek black sedan, walked up the steps, and turned the brass handle. The interior smelled like rich coffee, old leather, and aging paper. Elias Cole stood behind a long oak table. He appeared to be in his late 50s, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit without a tie. He possessed the quiet, sharp eyes of someone who reads contracts for sport. Surrounding him were stacks of heavy leather-bound ledgers. In the capital of the digital world, Elias Cole and my grandmother had kept physical books. "Please sit down, Adriana," he said, gesturing to a sturdy wooden chair. I took a seat. I looked at the ledgers. Some of them had dates stamped on the spines going back 3 decades. "You told me Richard distributed the bait," I said, getting straight to the point. "What does that mean?" Elias offered a faint, approving smile. "It means Evelyn understood the exact nature of the people sitting at that table with you today. She knew Julian is currently drowning in his own ambition. She knew Sienna cares only about the reflection she projects to strangers. Your grandmother did not leave them wealth. She left them a trap." He opened the thickest ledger on the table and turned it toward me. It was filled with lists of holding companies, shell corporations, and blind trusts. "Julian believes he is a self-made tech visionary." Elias continued, tapping a line of ink on the page. 3 years ago, when his startup was on the verge of bankruptcy, he secured a miraculous round of private equity funding. He thought it was a venture capital firm out of Seattle. It was not. It was your grandmother operating through a proxy. I leaned forward, trying to read the dense financial columns. What did she buy? "She did not just buy equity," Elias said. "She bought the core intellectual property. The patents for the software architecture Julian sells belong to a blind trust. Julian licenses that technology from the trust to keep his company afloat. He has no idea the entity he pays royalties to every quarter was controlled by Evelyn. Elias flipped a page, the heavy paper making a crisp sound in the quiet room. And then there is Sienna, he said. She was just handed the deed to a beautiful beachfront estate in Malibu. She owns the structure. She owns the drywall, the windows, and the plumbing. But in California, coastal real estate, the structure is just a depreciating asset. The true value is the dirt it sits on. My breath caught in my throat. Do not tell me. Elias nodded. Sienna does not own the land. Evelyn bought the physical acreage underneath that house 20 years ago. The house itself operates on a ground lease. That lease is set to expire in less than 4 months. I sat back in my chair, the sheer scale of my grandmother's architectural genius washing over me. Julian and Sienna had spent the entire morning gloating. They had mocked my clothes, my nursery, and my life. They thought they had won the lottery. Instead, they were standing on a trapdoor, and Evelyn had just handed me the lever. The envelope, I said quietly. The phone number. Elias closed the ledger. That number was your final test. If you had thrown the envelope away, or allowed your pride to stop you from making the call, the instructions would have shifted. But you called. Therefore, you are the sole beneficiary of the Evelyn Hayes Irrevocable Trust. He folded his hands on the table. You own the intellectual property keeping your brother out of bankruptcy. You own the soil beneath your sister's feet. You are quietly their landlord, their majority stakeholder, and the owner of tens of millions of dollars in liquid assets resting in offshore accounts. The silence in the room stretched out. I thought about the dirt under my fingernails. I thought about the coastal ecosystems I spent my days restoring. I understood root systems. I knew how to nurture something until it could stand on its own. Evelyn had just handed me an ecosystem of pure power. There is a condition, Elias said, his tone shifting into something far more serious. Of course there is, I replied. Evelyn never gave anything away for free. She wanted to see what Julian and Sienna would do when they thought they held all the cards, Elias explained. Wealth acts as a serum. It forces a person's true nature to the surface. You must not warn them. You cannot tell them about me, the trust, or the assets for 90 days. You must let them operate under the illusion of their own supremacy. And if I break the rule I asked, if I tell them, Elias pulled a legal document from a drawer and set it between us. The trust contains a strict non-disclosure and forfeiture clause. If you reveal your position before the 90 days expire, the trust dissolves. Every patent, every acre of land, and every dollar will be instantly liquidated and transferred to a marine conservation charity. You get nothing. They get nothing. Evelyn wanted me to watch them hang themselves, I realized. She wanted you to know exactly who you are dealing with before you assume control of this empire, Elias corrected. You are a gardener, Adriana. You know that before you can plant something new, you have to let the weeds expose their roots. He offered me a heavy silver pen. It was Evelyn's pen. I recognized the intricate engraving on the barrel. I took the pen. The metal was cool against my skin. I did not hesitate. I signed my name on the final page of the document, binding myself to the 90-day silence. Elias collected the paperwork, his posture relaxing just a fraction. You are officially the head of the Hayes estate, he said. We will meet again soon to review the investment portfolios. Until then, go back to your nursery. Keep your hands in the dirt. Act exactly as they expect you to act. I stood up, shaking his hand. The grip was firm, a silent pact between us. I walked out of the brick building and back into the harsh afternoon sun. The heat radiating off the asphalt felt different now. The world looked the same, but the underlying structure of my reality had shifted entirely. I was no longer the outcast. I was the architect. I unlocked my truck and climbed inside. Before I could even put the key in the ignition, my phone screen lit up on the passenger seat. The notification banner displayed a text message from Julian. I picked it up and read the words. Adriana, Mom says you are struggling with your rent. I have a massive estate tax bill hitting next week for the new portfolio. I need liquid cash. Sell that sad little plant shop of yours to a commercial developer and give me the proceeds to cover my taxes. Consider it your contribution to the family. If you do not list the property by Monday, I will have my lawyers bury your business in zoning lawsuits until you are bankrupt. I stared at the glowing screen. He had his $4 million for less than 3 hours, and his first instinct was to consume the only thing I had ever built. He was demanding I destroy my own livelihood to pay a tax bill for an inheritance that was already a mirage. He was not just arrogant, he was desperate, and he had no idea he was threatening the person holding the keys to his entire existence. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. Julian wanted me to liquidate 10 years of calluses, sunburns, and careful cultivation to pay the tax bill on a tech fortune that did not even belong to him. I did not type out a long defense. I did not try to reason with a man who viewed other people as stepping stones. I typed a single word. No. I pressed send and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The retaliation arrived with the speed of a Silicon Valley algorithm. Julian did not just get angry, he deployed his wife. Jessica Hayes was a woman who treated zip codes like battlegrounds and country club memberships like military ranks. She sat on 3 philanthropic boards in Monterey and possessed a contact list built entirely on social leverage. 48 hours after I sent my text, the nursery phone rang. It was the general manager of a luxury coastal resort. We had a signed agreement for a $200,000 dune restoration project. The manager cleared his throat, his voice tight. He fed me a line about budget restructuring and changing design directions. I heard the lie in his hesitation. Before the day ended, a second major client called to terminate a commercial hardscaping contract. Jessica had made a few phone calls. She had framed me as a liability, dropping hints to her wealthy friends about my financial instability and supposed erratic behavior following my grandmother's death. Sienna struck next. She did not use boardrooms, she used her audience. That evening, my lead botanist showed me a video on social media. Sienna was walking through the empty, echoing halls of her new Malibu estate, holding a crystal glass of champagne. The Pacific Ocean sparkled behind her through floor-to-ceiling windows. She held her perfectly manicured hand up to the camera lens. "So blessed to be entering this new chapter of generational wealth," she crooned into the microphone. "And so grateful I do not have to spend my life playing in the dirt to scrape by like certain estranged family members. Know your worth, angels." My botanist looked at me waiting for a reaction, waiting for me to defend myself. I just picked up my pruning shears and went back to work on a row of Japanese maples. I knew exactly where their hatred came from. It was not just about the money, it was about guilt. 3 years ago, when Evelyn was diagnosed with a degenerative heart condition, the doctors suggested a high-end assisted living facility. Julian and Sienna agreed instantly. A facility was clean, it was out of sight, it required no emotional effort. I refused. I packed my bags, drove up the coast, and moved a cot into Evelyn's ground floor study. I managed her complex medication schedules. I bathed her when her legs gave out. I sat awake at 3 in the morning, listening to her breathe. Julian and Sienna visited perhaps twice a year, staying for 20 minutes before checking their designer watches and making excuses about their busy schedules. But they whispered behind my back. They told their friends I was angling for the estate. They believed I was suffering through the indignity of elder care as a calculated financial strategy. They projected their own transactional nature onto me because they could not comprehend doing something simply because it was the right thing to do. The loss of the 2 commercial contracts hurt. I had payroll to meet. I had a mortgage on the nursery land. I sat in my small office running the numbers under the hum of a flickering fluorescent light. I had to pull from my modest emergency fund to cover the checks for my employees. It was a strange, isolating kind of torture. I possessed a piece of paper that made me worth tens of millions of dollars, yet I was eating ramen noodles for dinner to ensure my crew could feed their families. The 90-day silence clause felt like a physical weight sitting on my chest. I had to let Julian and Sienna believe they were winning. I had to let them think they were starving me out. 2 weeks into the silence, Elias Cole summoned me back to Palo Alto. The air in his office was cool, a sharp contrast to the blistering California heat radiating off the pavement outside. He did not offer small talk. He pointed to a fresh stack of manila folders resting on his oak table. "Your siblings are moving faster than I anticipated," Elias said, taking a seat opposite me. The inheritance acted like an accelerant on a grease fire. He opened the first folder. It contained internal banking summaries and board meeting minutes from Julian's tech company. Julian did not just need cash for estate taxes, Elias explained, his voice low and precise. His software platform has been hemorrhaging active users for 8 months. His initial investors have been demanding an audit. He took the $4 million Richard handed him and quietly funneled it directly into his corporate accounts to patch the sinking ship. I frowned, looking at the highlighted figures on the page. Is that illegal? It is when you categorize it as generated revenue to deceive your shareholders, Elias said. Julian is commingling personal inheritance with corporate assets to fabricate growth. He is paying off early investors with his new money to keep them quiet. He is running a textbook Ponzi structure, Adriana. And because he is doing it to inflate his company's valuation ahead of a proposed public offering, he is committing federal wire fraud. I stared at the pages, the reality of my brother's arrogance settling over me. He was risking decades in a federal penitentiary to maintain the illusion that he was a genius. Elias closed Julian's folder and opened the next one. This one contained property records and loan agreements filed in Los Angeles County. "Sienna is not faring much better," Elias continued. "Her cosmetic line is failing. The overseas manufacturer is demanding payment up front for the next production run because her previous checks bounced. Desperate for capital to keep up her influencer facade, she went to a private, unregulated lending firm." Elias tapped a thick paragraph near the bottom of a contract. "She used the Malibu estate as collateral for a high-interest business loan. She signed a document swearing she holds the title free and clear, but she only owns the structure," I said, the pieces of my grandmother's trap clicking into place. "She does not own the land." "Exactly," Elias said. "When the ground lease expires and the true owner of the land reclaims the property, the structure becomes effectively worthless to the lender. Sienna just committed bank fraud." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling a long breath. They were destroying themselves. Evelyn had known they lacked the discipline to handle unearned power. She gave them enough rope to hang themselves, and they were sprinting toward the gallows. "They are digging their own graves," I murmured. "All I have to do is wait." Elias did not smile. His expression tightened, the lines around his eyes deepening into shadows. He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out one final document. It was not a thick folder. It was a single printed page. "Waiting is no longer a passive exercise," Elias said. He slid the piece of paper across the smooth oak table. It stopped directly in front of me. I looked down. It was a digital copy of a loan application from a boutique commercial bank in San Jose. The requested amount was $750,000. The collateral listed was my botanical nursery in Carmel. I scanned the bottom of the page. My signature was inked on the dotted line. "I did not sign this," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I know you did not," Elias replied quietly. "Julian could not squeeze the cash out of you through his wife's smear campaign. He ran out of time, so he took matters into his own hands. Julian just tried to leverage your name on a fraudulent loan." I stared at the digital copy of the loan application resting on the oak table. My name was signed on the dotted line, but it was not my handwriting. The loop on the capital A was too tight. The slant of the Y leaned the wrong way. Julian had practiced this. He had studied my signature from old birthday cards, or perhaps a forgotten lease agreement sitting at his expensive desk, and calculating how to steal the only piece of the world I truly owned. He was trying to use my debt-free botanical nursery as collateral for a high-interest bridge loan. He needed $750,000 in cash to plug the holes in his failing software company. He assumed I was uneducated in corporate law. He believed I was a simple gardener who never checked county property records or monitored her credit score. He thought he could secure the loan, pay it back after his fraudulent public offering, and I would never even know he had placed my entire livelihood on the chopping block. Elias watched me from across the table. He did not offer pity. He offered strategy. If we confront him right now, Elias said, Julian will claim it was a clerical error. He will hire a team of defense attorneys to bury the truth in paperwork. He will spin a narrative that he was acting as your financial proxy. I set the paper down. The anger in my chest was cold and sharp. Julian had spent his entire life taking things from me. When we were children, he broke my toys and blamed the dog. When we were teenagers, he took money from my wallet and convinced our mother I had lost it. Patricia always covered for him. She smoothed over his mistakes because he was her golden boy, the son destined to elevate the family name. But Patricia was not here, and Julian had just escalated from petty theft to federal wire fraud. We are not going to confront him, I said, looking up at Elias. We are going to let him submit it. Elias leaned back, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his features. Explain your logic, Adriana. If we stop him now, he gets away with a warning, I replied. But if he submits a forged document to a commercial bank across state lines, he commits a felony. I want you to contact the fraud department of this specific lender. Do not make a public scene. Just flag the application. Provide them with my sworn affidavit that the signature is a forgery and that I do not authorize the lien. Let the bank build the paper trail. Let them report it to the federal regulators. Elias typed a quick sequence into his laptop. Consider it done. The trap is set. 2 days later, my phone vibrated with a calendar invite. It was a summons from Patricia. She required the entire family to attend a dinner at a highly exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant in the heart of San Francisco. Attendance was not optional. Patricia thrived on optics. She needed to sit in a room full of wealthy strangers and project the image of a flawless American dynasty. I drove up the coast in my Ford pickup. I pulled up to the restaurant entrance where a line of luxury European sedans sat idling. The valet took my keys with a thinly veiled look of confusion, his white gloves stark against the faded paint of my truck door. I wore a simple black dress. It was clean, understated, and cost less than the appetizers we were about to order. The dining room was a temple of quiet wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over white linen tablecloths. The waiters moved like ghosts, speaking in hushed, reverent tones. I found my family sitting at a corner booth. Julian wore a tailored navy suit, checking his phone every 30 seconds. Sienna was adjusting the lighting on her smartphone camera, trying to capture the perfect angle of her artisan cocktail. Patricia sat at the head of the table wearing a pearl necklace and a smile that did not reach her eyes. Look who decided to grace us with her presence, Julian said as I took my seat. Did you have to pawn a lawnmower to afford the parking fee? Sienna laughed, not looking up from her screen. Be nice, Julian. She probably walked here. I placed my napkin on my lap and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. Good evening, Mother. Julian. Sienna. Patricia sighed, signaling a waiter to bring the menus. I am just glad we are all together, she announced. We have so much to celebrate. Julian is making brilliant moves with the tech portfolio. Sienna is elevating her brand. Evelyn would be so proud of how well her wealth is being managed. The waiter arrived and began listing a complex tasting menu involving truffles and imported caviar. I ordered a simple fish dish. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. I sat in silence, eating my meal, listening to them inflate their own egos. Sienna talked at length about the Italian marble she was importing for the kitchen island in Malibu. She complained about the shipping delays, completely unaware that her right to even stand in that kitchen was evaporating by the hour. When the waiter cleared the main courses, Patricia reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a crisp white envelope. She placed it on the table and slid it across the linen cloth until it stopped next to my water glass. I know things have been difficult for you lately, Adriana, Patricia said, raising her voice just enough so the neighboring table could hear. With the loss of those landscaping contracts, I worry about your basic needs. I want you to have this. It is $500 for groceries, or perhaps some new work boots. Julian snickered behind his wine glass. Sienna smiled a tight, patronizing smile. They were waiting for me to break. They wanted me to flush red with humiliation. They wanted me to throw the envelope back in Patricia's face so they could call me ungrateful and unstable. I looked at the envelope. I thought about the offshore accounts resting under my name. I thought about the intellectual property patents sitting in a vault in Palo Alto. I was currently worth upwards of $60 million. I reached out, picked up the envelope, and slipped it into my purse. "Thank you, Mom," I said, keeping my voice soft and placid. "I appreciate your generosity." The reaction was immediate. Julian's jaw tightened. Sienna looked disappointed. They hated that I did not fight back. My calm acceptance robbed them of the dramatic scene they craved. Dessert arrived in the form of spun sugar and dark chocolate. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He could not stand the lack of tension. He needed to assert his dominance. "You should really start thinking about a career change, Adriana," he said, pointing a silver dessert spoon at me. "The plant business is a dead end. Next quarter, my company is filing for an initial public offering. When we go public, I am going to be a billionaire. I will be on the cover of magazines. You will still be covered in mud. It is just sad. You have zero ambition. You do not understand how the real world works. You do not understand assets." He took a bite of his dessert, chewing with a smug, self-satisfied rhythm. I took a slow sip of my water. I set the crystal glass down on the table. I looked directly into his eyes. "Are you sure your intellectual property is secure, Julian?" The question hung in the air, quiet but razor sharp. Julian stopped chewing. The silver spoon hovered an inch from the table. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant mask vanished. His eyes widened, searching my face for the punchline. He tried to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. I did not blink. "I asked if you are sure your IP is secure. The code, the patents, the foundation of your entire public offering." Sienna rolled her eyes. "Do not try to use big words, Adriana. You sound ridiculous." But Julian did not look at Sienna. He stared at me. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. "You do not know what you are talking about," he stammered. "My patents are locked up. I license them from a private trust. It is ironclad. You are just repeating terms you heard on television." Before he could finish his sentence, a sharp, buzzing sound vibrated against the table. Julian's phone was ringing. He glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed the name of his lead venture capital investor. It was 9 o'clock at night. Lead investors do not call at 9 o'clock at night to offer congratulations. Julian swallowed hard. He picked up the phone and pressed it to his ear. "Yes, this is Julian." He sat frozen in the velvet booth. I watched the blood drain out of his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His breathing turned shallow. The voice on the other end of the line was loud enough that I could hear the frantic, panicked pitch, even if I could not make out the exact words. Julian lowered the phone slowly. He did not hang up. He just let it rest against the white tablecloth. He looked at the crystal chandeliers. He looked at Patricia. Finally, he looked at me. "The rights," he whispered, the words barely making it past his lips. "The holding company just froze the licensing rights to my entire software platform." Julian stood up from the velvet booth so fast his water glass tipped over. Ice cubes scattered across the white linen tablecloth, pooling water around the base of the crystal chandelier centerpiece. He did not apologize to the waiter. He did not look at our mother. He just turned and sprinted toward the restaurant exit, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble floor. Patricia called his name, her voice tight with confusion and embarrassment, but the heavy glass doors had already swung shut behind him. Sienna barely looked up from her smartphone. She used her napkin to dab a drop of spilled water off her designer purse. "He is probably just dealing with a server crash," she muttered, returning her attention to her screen. She leaned over to show Patricia a digital rendering of a $200,000 open-concept dining space. She was ordering custom cabinetry from Italy, talking about tearing down load-bearing walls, oblivious to the fact that she was decorating a house resting on borrowed dirt. I finished my sparkling water, placed my portion of the bill in cash on the table, and walked out into the cool San Francisco night. The drive back down the coast cleared my head. The next morning I was back in the greenhouse by 6. Jessica had tried to destroy my reputation among the Monterey elite, and for a few weeks, The nursery phone had stopped ringing. But high society gossip operates on a strange frequency. When the loudest, most obnoxious people in a country club tear someone down, it catches the attention of the people who despise them. By noon, a sleek silver car pulled into the gravel driveway of my nursery. A man in his late 60s stepped out. He did not wear a suit. He wore faded jeans and a simple gray sweater, but the watch on his wrist cost more than my entire property. He introduced himself as a retired software engineer who had recently purchased 40 acres of undeveloped coastline in Big Sur. He had heard from Jessica at a charity gala that I was difficult private and refused to play social games. He hired me on the spot. He wanted a full ecological restoration of his property, removing invasive species and planting native coastal scrub. He valued discretion above all else. I secured a contract worth triple the ones Julian had sabotaged. I spent the rest of the week hauling native sagebrush, letting the physical labor anchor me while the invisible clock ticked down. While my hands were in the soil, my siblings were sinking. Evelyn had taught me to always read the fine print, so I watched their digital footprints. Sienna maintained her cheerful online facade, posting daily updates about the Malibu renovation. She filmed herself knocking down drywall with a golden sledgehammer. But Elias sent me the real narrative through encrypted emails. Sienna owned a vanity cosmetics brand. She manufactured the products overseas using cheap filler ingredients to maximize her profit margins, stamping her name on bottles of lotion she had never personally tested. The federal regulators had finally inspected a batch of her top-selling facial serum after a wave of customer complaints. The laboratory results showed dangerous levels of toxic compounds that caused severe chemical burns. The regulatory agency slapped her company with a 7-figure penalty and issued an immediate public recall. The fallout was swift. Her sponsors started pulling their contracts to distance themselves from the scandal. The curated influencer life runs on a strict cash flow, and Sienna was suddenly bleeding capital. She needed liquid assets to pay the federal penalty before the news leaked to the mainstream beauty blogs and destroyed her image forever. She could not ask Julian, who was fighting his own invisible war, and Patricia was already stretched thin, keeping up appearances in Palo Alto. So Sienna made a logical, fatal choice. She decided to subdivide and sell a half-acre parcel of the Malibu estate. Elias called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was repairing a drip irrigation line in the lower greenhouse. The California sun was beating down on the glass roof. I answered the phone, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my leather glove. "The trap is snapping shut," Elias said, his voice crisp over the speaker. Sienna hired a real estate broker to list the eastern parcel of the Malibu property. They priced it below market value for a quick sale. They found a cash buyer within 48 hours. The buyer submitted the paperwork to the title company this morning. I turned off the water valve. "What happened?" "The title company rejected the transfer," Elias replied. "They ran the deed history and hit the ground lease. Sienna's broker just received the legal notice. Sienna cannot sell the land because she only owns the physical house. The broker is reviewing the documents right now. By the end of the business day, your sister is going to receive a phone call explaining that her entire net worth is an illusion. She is trapped in a house she cannot afford, sitting on soil she does not own, with a federal fine due in less than a month." "And Julian?" I asked, leaning against a wooden potting bench. "He is burning through retainers," Elias said. "He hired 3 different corporate law firms to find out who controls the holding company that froze his intellectual property. They are hitting brick walls. The blind trust is impenetrable. He thinks a rival tech conglomerate is staging a hostile takeover to force him out before his public offering. He has no idea it is you. Keep your doors locked, Adriana. Desperation breeds unpredictability." I thanked Elias and ended the call. The 90-day silence clause felt lighter now. It was doing the heavy lifting for me. I went home to my small wooden cabin nestled in the Carmel Valley. I made a cup of tea, read a book on coastal weather patterns, and went to sleep to the sound of the wind moving through the pine trees. The clock on my nightstand read 12:14 when the banging started. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic, heavy pounding of a fist against solid wood. The sound echoed through the quiet valley, sharp enough to startle the night birds roosting in the rafters of my porch. I slid out of bed, pulling a thick wool sweater over my shoulders. I walked into the dark living room, my bare feet quiet against the hardwood floor. I did not turn on the lights. I approached the front door and looked through the small glass pane. Julian stood on my porch. He looked ruined. The pristine navy suit from the restaurant was gone, replaced by a wrinkled jacket and an untucked shirt. His tie hung loose around his neck. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes were wide, darting toward the shadows of the redwood trees surrounding my property. He raised his fist to hammer on the door again. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches, keeping my foot wedged firmly against the frame. "What do you want, Julian?" He shoved his hand against the wood, trying to push the door wider, but I held my ground. He smelled like stale coffee panic and cheap scotch. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. "How did you know?" he demanded, his voice a frantic hiss. "At the restaurant. You asked about my intellectual property right before the holding company locked me out. How did you know they were going to freeze the assets?" "I do not know what you are talking about," I said, keeping my face perfectly blank. "I read an article about software patents on the internet. It was a simple question. You are the one who panicked and ran out of the room." He leaned in closer, his face inches from the narrow opening of the door. His eyes were bloodshot. "Do not play games with me, Adriana. You are talking to someone. Did you meet one of my board members? Are you funneling insider information to a competitor? If you think you can use my corporate crisis to extort money out of me, you have lost your mind." I stared at him. He was projecting his own nature onto me again. He assumed I was running a scheme because a scheme was the only language he spoke. He could not fathom a world where he was outsmarted by the sister he viewed as a peasant. "I am dealing with a corporate sabotage campaign that could cost me everything." Julian spat, gripping the edge of the doorframe so hard his knuckles turned white. "I am on the verge of losing my company. If you breathe a single word of this to our mother, or if you tell anyone about that loan application you think I forged, I will unleash a legal team that will tie you up in court for the next 10 years. I will drag your little botanical business through so much litigation you will never touch soil again. Do you understand me?" He was standing on my porch in the dead of night, a man sitting on the edge of a federal indictment, threatening the exact person who held the deed to his freedom. Julian stood under the harsh glare of my porch light. His breathing was loud enough to drown out the sound of the wind moving through the valley. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest. "You are feeding information to Apex Data," he said, naming his largest corporate rival. "You met with their board of directors. You gave them the leverage to orchestrate this holding company freeze. I know you did it, Adriana. It is the only logical explanation." I looked at the wrinkled fabric of his designer jacket. The man who had mocked my work clothes less than a month ago now looked like he had slept on a concrete sidewalk. His tie hung loose around his neck, and his eyes were bloodshot, darting toward the shadows of the redwood trees surrounding my property, as if he expected corporate spies to emerge from the brush. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "listen to yourself." "Do not patronize me," he snapped, taking a half step closer. "You sat at that restaurant and asked about my intellectual property. 10 seconds later, my lead investor calls to tell me I am locked out of my own software architecture. You are trying to extort me. You want a piece of the public offering." I crossed my arms against the chill of the midnight air. I let him stew in his own paranoia for a long moment before answering. "I am a dirt under the fingernails gardener," I said, repeating the exact phrase Sienna had broadcasted to her followers just weeks prior. "I spend my days propagating native shrubs and calculating soil acidity levels. How could I possibly understand intellectual property law? How would I even know how to contact the board of directors at a major tech conglomerate, let alone negotiate a corporate takeover to freeze your assets?" Julian blinked. The logic hit him like a bucket of ice water. He had spent his entire adult life convincing himself that I was uneducated and irrelevant. To believe I was orchestrating a multi-million-dollar corporate coup meant dismantling the core hierarchy of his worldview. He could not accept that I was smart enough to destroy him. You read an article, he muttered, trying to convince himself, his voice losing its sharp edge. I read an article, I agreed flatly. And you panicked because you are running a fragile operation. If your investors are freezing you out, that is a reflection of your leadership, not my gardening hobby. Go home, Julian. Fix your own company. I shut the door in his face and turned the deadbolt. I listened to his footsteps crunch heavily across the gravel driveway, followed by the roar of his engine as he sped back toward the highway. The following morning, the coastal fog burned off early. I was reviewing nutrient reports in my office when the phone rang. It was Elias. Your brother is officially trapped, Elias announced, skipping any formal greeting. I leaned back in my chair, tracing the edge of a ceramic planter on my desk. He came to my house last night. He thinks I am selling corporate secrets to his rivals. His paranoia is serving us perfectly, Elias replied. It keeps him distracted from the actual threat. But today the game shifts. Evelyn did not just leave him $4 million to see if he would steal. She built a tripwire into the initial transfer. I stopped tracing the planter. What kind of tripwire? A morality clause, Elias explained. The inheritance required the beneficiary to maintain the funds in a designated transparent trust account for 1 calendar year. Julian did not do that. He transferred the capital directly into his corporate accounts to hide his financial decay. By commingling estate funds with fraudulent business operations, he triggered a breach of contract. What happens when the clause is breached, I asked. It automatically triggers a mandatory forensic audit of the entire estate, Elias said. Federal accountants are appointed to review every ledger, every transaction, and every tax filing connected to the beneficiaries. The regulators are going to tear Julian's finances apart layer by layer. They will find the phantom revenue. They will find the forged loan applications. There is no hiding anymore. I felt a chill run down my spine. Evelyn had engineered a sequence of events that required no action on my part. Julian was his own executioner. 2 hours later, my cell phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. Patricia rarely called before noon unless she had an audience to impress. You need to come to Palo Alto right now, Patricia said the moment I answered. Her voice was thin, pitched high with panic. I have a business to run, Mom, I replied. This is about the family, she insisted. Julian is in trouble. A team of auditors just contacted my accountant. They are investigating the estate. They are looking into Julian's business loans. You have to come here. She ended the call before I could refuse. I knew exactly what she wanted. I handed my clipboard to my lead botanist, got into my truck, and drove north. Patricia lived in a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion in a gated Palo Alto enclave. The manicured lawns looked unnatural, too green and perfectly uniform. I walked through the heavy double doors and found my mother pacing the length of her formal living room. She clutched a crystal glass of sparkling water, her knuckles white. Thank God you are here, she said, rushing toward me. She did not offer a hug. She never did. The auditors are pulling property records. They found a commercial loan application attached to your nursery. I stood near the entryway, keeping my distance. I am aware. Patricia stopped pacing. She looked at me, her eyes wide and desperate. Julian told me everything. He was under so much stress. The investors were threatening him. He needed short-term capital to keep his company afloat until the public offering. He borrowed your signature. He committed felony forgery, I corrected her. Patricia waved her free hand, dismissing the legal reality as if it were a minor social faux pas. Do not use those dramatic words, Adriana. He made a mistake. He is your brother. He is the future of this family. If the federal regulators see that application, they will refer it to the district attorney. He could go to prison. He should have thought about that before he tried to steal my property, I said. Patricia stepped closer, her voice trembling. You do not understand the stakes. The social fallout will destroy us. Sienna will lose her brand sponsorships. I will be ruined in this community. We can fix this right now. How, I asked, knowing the answer, but forcing her to say it out loud. You call the bank? Patricia pleaded, tears spilling over her mascara. You tell them the signature is genuine. You tell them you authorize the loan to help your brother's business. You take responsibility for the application. It becomes a simple family misunderstanding, not a federal crime. She wanted me to absorb his guilt. She wanted me to place my own neck in a legal noose so her golden child could walk free. For 31 years, I had watched her prioritize the illusion of perfection over the reality of my existence. I had always suspected that if it came down to a choice between saving Julian or sacrificing me, she would not hesitate. Standing in that opulent, sterile living room, the final thread of familial loyalty snapped. I felt nothing but a hollow, echoing clarity. "You want me to lie to federal investigators?" I said, my voice quiet in the cavernous room. Patricia reached out, trying to grab my arm. "I am begging you to be the bigger person. Sacrifice this one thing for Julian's future. You have your plans. You have your simple life. You do not have a reputation to lose. Julian has everything to lose." I stepped back, letting her hand fall to her side. The tears on her face were real, but they were born from self-preservation, not love. She viewed me as a shield to be discarded. "My simple life is built on telling the truth," I said. "I will not lie for a felon, Mom." Patricia gasped, taking a step back as if I had struck her. "You are destroying this family." "I am just watching it burn," I replied. Julian lit the match. I turned around and walked out of the house. I did not look back. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, sealing Patricia inside her crumbling fortress of optics and lies. I walked down the paved driveway toward my truck. The afternoon sun was warm against my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I felt untethered from the Hayes family name. The guilt they had tried to instill in me evaporated into the dry California air. I unlocked my truck and climbed into the driver's seat. I placed my keys in the ignition but did not turn them. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a message from Elias. There was no text, just a single high-resolution photograph. I opened the image. It was a shot of Julian's sleek corporate headquarters in Silicon Valley. A row of dark, unmarked government vehicles blocked the entrance. Agents wearing navy blue windbreakers with yellow block letters reading SEC across the back were carrying boxes of hard drives and paper files out the front doors. The photograph from Elias was just the beginning. By noon, the financial news networks picked up the story. Julian Hayes, the supposed prodigy of Silicon Valley, was plastered across every screen. The anchors did not use words like innovator or visionary anymore. They used phrases like defrauding investors and federal wire fraud. The technology blogs dismantled his company within hours. Investigative journalists revealed how he used fresh venture capital to pay off early backers, creating a phantom ledger that projected impossible growth. The federal government acted with swift, terrifying precision. Because Julian had funneled his inheritance directly into those tainted accounts to cover his tracks, the Securities and Exchange Commission froze every single dollar connected to his name. He could not access his offshore accounts. He could not sell his stock options. He could not even buy a cup of coffee or pay a retainer for a defense attorney. His life was locked behind a federal seal. 300 miles south, the ocean breeze blowing through Malibu was carrying its own kind of destruction. Sienna was in the middle of filming a skincare routine in her marble bathroom when a courier knocked on her heavy oak front door. He did not hand her a promotional package. He handed her a certified legal notice from a commercial title company. Sienna signed for it, her manicured nails tapping against the clipboard. She opened the thick envelope on her kitchen island, expecting a routine tax document. Instead, the document outlined the stipulations of the ground lease attached to her property. It stated in plain, irrefutable legal terms that the lease had expired. The corporate trust that owned the soil beneath her house was exercising its right to reclaim the land. Sienna had 30 days to vacate the premises. Her only other option was to purchase the physical acreage for $15 million. Sienna did not have $15 million. She barely had enough liquid cash to pay the upcoming fine from the Food and Drug Administration regarding her toxic cosmetic line. Her sponsors were dropping her by the hour. Her influence was evaporating as beauty bloggers dissected the chemical burns her products had caused. She looked around the cavernous kitchen, staring at the walls she had planned to tear down. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was not a wealthy landowner, she was a tenant on borrowed dirt, and her landlord was evicting her. She picked up her phone and did the only thing she could think to do. She called Julian. Julian answered the phone from the parking lot of a cheap motel. He had been locked out of his own condominium by federal agents. Sienna demanded he wire her a loan. She cried into the receiver, explaining the ground lease and the eviction notice, begging him to use his tech fortune to buy the Malibu land so she could save face. Julian laughed. It was a cold, bitter sound that echoed through the phone speaker. He told her his bank accounts were locked by federal mandate. He told her he was facing a decade in a white-collar prison. They screamed at each other over the phone. Sienna accused him of ruining the family name and tanking her brand by association. Julian accused her of being a shallow parasite who never understood how real money worked. They were two drowning people fighting over an anchor. They had spent their entire lives united by their shared arrogance, but the moment the money vanished, the loyalty vanished with it. I watched the news cycle unfold from the quiet sanctuary of my Carmel nursery. I sat at my wooden workbench tending to a 50-year-old juniper bonsai. Bonsai cultivation requires a ruthless kind of patience. You have to wire the branches, prune the roots, and force the tree into a structured path. If you let it grow wild, it loses its shape. If you cut too much, it dies. Evelyn Hayes treated her wealth the exact same way. She understood that money required discipline. She knew Julian and Sienna lacked that discipline, so she gave them enough unearned capital to let their worst impulses grow wild. I clipped a dead branch from the juniper. I had not lifted a single finger to destroy my siblings. I had not hacked their bank accounts, planted evidence in their offices, or tipped off the journalists. I just sat in silence for a few weeks. Evelyn's brilliant legal architecture simply handed them the tools they needed to dismantle their own lives. Their greed did the heavy lifting. I swept the clipped branches off my workbench, feeling a profound sense of peace. The storm was ravaging Silicon Valley and Los Angeles, but the air in Carmel was clear. But cornered animals are dangerous. Julian and Sienna realized they were out of options. They could not borrow from Patricia, who was drowning in the debts she took on to maintain her social standing. They could not borrow from their wealthy friends who had abandoned them the moment the federal raid hit the news. They needed a lifeboat. They needed an asset that was unencumbered by federal liens, toxic brand deals, or expiring leases. They looked north. They looked at my nursery. My business was debt-free. The coastal land it sat on had doubled in value over the past decade. More importantly, I possessed a clean credit score and a pristine public record. I was the perfect financial host for them to drain. But they knew I would never willingly sign over my property to save them, especially after I refused to lie to the bank about the forged loan application. So they turned to a darker tactic. California has a specific legal mechanism designed to protect the vulnerable. It allows family members to petition the court for control over an individual who is deemed mentally unfit to manage their own affairs. It is called a conservatorship. In the hands of honest people, it is a shield. In the hands of the wealthy and desperate, it is a weapon used to strip a person of their autonomy and steal their assets legally. Julian and Sienna pooled the last of their hidden cash to hire a predatory attorney based in Los Angeles. This attorney specialized in expedited family law and aggressive asset seizure. Together, they drafted a petition declaring that I was exhibiting severe emotional instability following our grandmother's death. They cited my refusal to help the family financially as proof of my diminished capacity. They claimed my choice to live an isolated life in Carmel working with plants instead of pursuing a corporate career was a sign of a break from reality. The document was a masterpiece of legal fiction. They asked a judge to grant them immediate power of attorney over my medical decisions, my personal bank accounts, and my business operations. If the judge signed the emergency order, Julian and Sienna could legally seize my nursery, sell it to a commercial developer, and use the proceeds to hire criminal defense lawyers and pay off their federal fines. I would be locked out of my own life, reduced to a legal dependent, under the control of the very people trying to ruin me. They printed the documents and bound them in thick legal folders. They believed I was just a dirt-stained gardener who would panic and crumble when faced with aggressive legal threats. They thought they could ambush me at my workplace, force me into a psychiatric evaluation, and steal the keys to my independence. They packed their bags, got into a rental car, and started the drive up the Pacific Coast Highway, bringing their desperate war directly to my front door. The coastal fog had lifted by early afternoon, leaving the Carmel Valley bathed in sharp, unfiltered sunlight. I was in the main greenhouse transplanting a series of endangered coastal succulents. My hands were coated in a mixture of perlite and damp soil. The nursery was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the irrigation system. I found a certain rhythm in the work, a steady, predictable sequence of cause and effect that the human world rarely offered. The crunch of heavy tires on gravel broke the silence. I looked through the glass panes of the greenhouse. A rented black luxury SUV pulled up to the main office structure, parking haphazardly across two designated spaces. The engine cut off and 3 doors opened simultaneously. Julian stepped out first. The tailored suits he usually wore were gone, replaced by a rumpled button-down shirt and a jacket that looked like it had been slept in. Sienna followed, wearing oversized designer sunglasses that covered half her face, attempting to hide the stress breakouts lining her jaw. Behind them emerged a man I had never seen before. He wore a high-gloss fitted gray suit and carried a thick leather binder. He possessed the polished, predatory posture of a Los Angeles litigator who billed by the minute and thrived on misery. They marched toward my office without pausing to knock. I wiped my hands on a towel, left the greenhouse, and followed them inside. By the time I crossed the threshold, they had already taken over the small room. Julian was pacing the floorboards. Sienna stood near the window, her arms crossed tight against her chest. The lawyer stood directly in front of my desk, tapping his silver pen against the leather binder. I walked around the desk and took my seat. I did not offer them water. I did not ask how their drive was. "Good afternoon," I said. The lawyer placed the heavy binder on the reclaimed wood surface of my desk. He did not extend his hand. "My name is Donovan Reed," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I represent your brother and sister. We are here to execute an emergency petition for a conservatorship over your person and your estate." I looked at the binder. The legal seal of the Los Angeles County Superior Court was stamped across the top page. I leaned back in my chair. "A conservatorship." Julian stopped pacing and pointed a finger at me. "Do not play dumb, Adriana. We know you are losing your grip on reality. You have been isolating yourself. You refuse to help your own family during a financial crisis. You are living in a shack playing with dirt while holding on to a commercial property you lack the mental capacity to manage. You are erratic." Sienna took off her sunglasses, her eyes wide with a poorly acted imitation of sisterly concern. "We are doing this because we love you," she said, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "You need professional help. The isolation is making you paranoid. We just want to get you into a safe facility where doctors can evaluate your mental decline." The audacity of their plan hung in the air. In wealthy California enclaves, when someone becomes an obstacle, you do not argue with them. You pathologize them. It was a well-documented strategy among the elite. If you cannot buy a person, you declare them incompetent. You strip them of their civil rights, place their assets under the control of a trusted guardian, and liquidate their life to fund your own survival. They intended to lock me in a psychiatric ward, sell my nursery to a commercial developer, and use my clean money to pay their federal fines. Donovan Reed opened the binder to a signature page. "The judge has scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning," he said. "Given the sworn affidavits provided by your family members regarding your unstable behavior, the court is highly likely to grant temporary control to Julian. If you sign this voluntary surrender of power of attorney right now, we can avoid a messy public spectacle." If you refuse, we will have law enforcement escort you to a medical facility for a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold. They were cornering me. They thought I was a simple, frightened gardener who would buckle under the weight of a legal threat and the terrifying prospect of forced institutionalization. They expected tears. They expected me to beg for mercy. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my sanity. I kept my hands resting flat on the wooden desk, feeling the familiar grooves of the grain. "You want to steal my business to pay your defense attorneys, Julian," I said evenly. "And you, Sienna, need cash to settle a federal cosmetic fine before you end up in a holding cell next to him." Julian slammed his hand on the desk. "Sign the paper, Adriana. You have no money to fight this. You have no lawyers. You are a nobody holding a piece of land you do not deserve. Sign it, or I swear I will have paramedics strap you to a gurney before the sun goes down." The threat echoed off the botanical charts hanging on my office walls. The silence that followed was dense, suffocating. They waited for my surrender. Instead, I reached my right hand under the lip of my desk. I found the small, discreet button Elias had instructed my security team to install 3 weeks prior. I pressed it once. A sharp click sounded from the rear of the building. The heavy oak door connecting my office to the back supply room swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. 2 men stepped through the doorway first. They wore dark tailored suits, but their posture gave them away. They were private security contractors built like concrete pillars, their eyes scanning the room with cold professional efficiency. They fanned out, taking positions by the exit, blocking Julian Sienna and Donovan Reed from leaving. Then Elias Cole walked into the room. He wore his signature charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. He carried a slim, locked leather briefcase. He moved with the quiet, devastating authority of a man who held the fate of entire corporations in his hands. Julian froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked ill. In the high-stakes ecosystem of Silicon Valley, everyone knew who Elias Cole was. He was the Phantom. He was the wealth manager who orchestrated hostile takeovers and shielded billionaires from federal scrutiny. He was not a man who visited retail nurseries in Carmel. "What are you doing here?" Julian stammered, his voice cracking. "Why is Elias Cole standing in a dirty plant shop?" Donovan Reed looked at Julian, then at Elias, his predatory confidence faltering. He closed his legal binder, sensing a catastrophic shift in the power dynamic. Elias walked to the side of my desk. He did not look at the lawyer. He did not look at Sienna. He locked his gaze on Julian. "I am here because my client requested my presence," Elias said, his voice crisp and carrying the weight of a gavel striking wood. "Allow me to formally introduce myself. I am the executor of the Evelyn Hayes Irrevocable Trust." Sienna blinked, confused by the legal terminology. Julian, however, stopped breathing. The gears in his mind grinded together as the truth began to materialize. Elias set the leather briefcase on my desk. The twin brass locks opened with a sharp, synchronized snap. He reached inside and pulled out 2 thick stacks of watermarked paper. He placed the first stack in front of me. "This is the master deed to the Malibu coastal acreage," Elias stated. Sienna let out a choked gasp, stepping back as if the paper had caught fire. Elias placed the second stack next to the first. "And these are the patents and licensing agreements controlling the core software architecture currently utilized by your tech startup." Julian stared at the documents. His hands began to shake. The reality of his situation crashed down on him, crushing the last remnants of his fragile ego. The nameless, faceless corporate entity that had frozen his assets, trapped him in a corner, and sent federal agents to his door was not a rival tech conglomerate. It was his younger sister, the gardener, the punchline. I looked at my brother, whose future was currently resting under my fingertips. I looked at my sister, who was realizing she was homeless. I looked at the lawyer, who quietly took a step backward toward the door. I picked up Evelyn's silver pen from my desk drawer. I rested it on top of the patent documents. "I think it is time we talk about who actually owns this family," I said. The silence inside the nursery office was profound. The rhythmic dripping of a loose irrigation valve echoed from the greenhouse, counting the seconds. Julian stared at the watermarked patent documents resting on my reclaimed wood desk. His breath hitched a shallow, ragged sound. Sienna looked at the Malibu property deed, her oversized sunglasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. Donovan Reed, the Los Angeles litigator they brought to destroy me, took another slow step backward. He bumped into the doorframe. He was a man who read power dynamics for a living, and he recognized immediately that he was standing on the wrong side of the executioner block. I sat back in my chair. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Grandma Evelyn left you both exactly what you deserved, I said. She knew who you were. She knew you. Julian lacked the patience to build a real company. She knew you, Sienna, cared only about the reflection you projected to strangers. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords failed him. He gripped the edge of my desk, his knuckles turning stark white against the dark wood. Evelyn did not leave you wealth. I continued, keeping my tone clinical. She left you a highly calibrated trap. The millions Richard handed you at the will reading were tethered to audited accounts. They were designed to trigger federal oversight the moment you engaged in fraud. She gave you the capital, and you chose to mix it with stolen money. She knew you would dig your own graves if someone simply handed you the shovel. Sienna shook her head, the meticulously styled waves of her hair falling over her shoulders. "This is a mistake," she whispered. "You are a gardener, Adriana. You cannot possibly afford these assets." "I am the sole beneficiary of the Evelyn Hayes Irrevocable Trust," I replied. The yellow envelope at the will reading contained the access code. While you were planning renovations on a house you did not own, I assumed control of the entity that holds the ground lease. While you, Julian, were forging my signature on a commercial loan, I was authorizing Elias to lock you out of the software architecture you stole from your own investors. I hold the master keys. I own the dirt under your feet, and I own the code keeping you out of a federal penitentiary. Julian turned the color of ash. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence evaporated. The tailored suits, the Silicon Valley bravado, the endless mocking of my chosen profession, it all shattered against the undeniable proof resting on my desk. He was a tenant in his own life. Sienna collapsed into the leather guest chair. The performance began immediately. Tears pooled in the corners of her eyes, carefully calibrated not to ruin her expensive makeup. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a series of orchestrated, breathy sobs. "Adriana, please!" Sienna cried, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "We were just so stressed. The cosmetic recall ruined my brand. Julian has been under so much pressure from his board of directors. We did not mean the things we said in the conservatorship petition. We were scared. We just needed a financial bridge. You are our sister. You know we love you." I watched her perform. Growing up, Sienna used those exact tears to escape every consequence. When she crashed our father's car, she cried until he apologized to her. When she stole from my savings to buy a designer handbag, she wept about the pressure to fit in at her private high school. Our mother always fell for it. Our mother always rewarded the theater. "I am not Patricia," I said, cutting through her fake sobs. "You do not get to threaten me with a psychiatric ward and then beg for sisterly mercy when the gun backfires." Sienna stopped crying. Her hands dropped to her lap. The tears vanished, replaced by a cold, terrified realization that her primary weapon held zero ammunition. I looked at Elias. He stepped forward and opened a thin black folder he held under his arm. He extracted 2 single sheets of paper and placed them side by side on the center of my desk. He uncapped Evelyn's silver pen and laid it between them. "You came here today to force me to sign away my autonomy," I said, leaning forward. "Now you are going to sign yours away." I pointed to the document on the left. "This is a quitclaim deed, Sienna. It surrenders all your remaining rights to the physical structure of the Malibu estate back to the trust. It terminates your occupancy." I moved my finger to the document on the right. "This is a formal confession of federal wire fraud, Julian. It outlines your scheme to inflate your corporate valuation, your illegal commingling of estate funds, and your attempt to forge my signature on a commercial loan application." Julian stared at the confession. The muscles in his jaw ticked frantically. If I sign that I am admitting to multiple felonies, I will be barred from operating any corporate entity. I will be ruined. You are already ruined, Julian Elias stated, his voice devoid of sympathy. The Securities and Exchange Commission is currently cataloging your hard drives. The Venture Capital Board is drafting civil lawsuits. This document simply expedites the inevitable. I slid the silver pen closer to them. Sign them, I said coldly. Sign them right now, or I let the federal regulators and the commercial banks destroy you both. I will hand over the audio recording of this extortion attempt. I will release the forged loan application, and I will let the system bury you under decades of litigation. Julian stared at the silver pen. He looked at the armed security contractors blocking the exit. He looked at the Los Angeles lawyer who was currently staring at his own shoes, calculating how fast he could retreat to his rental car. The reality of his defeat broke something deep inside Julian's mind. He had spent his life stepping on the necks of everyone around him, buoyed by the delusion of his own supremacy. Being outmaneuvered by the sister he viewed as dirt was a humiliation his fragile psychology could not process. He let out a primal, guttural sound. It was not a word. It was pure, unfiltered rage. Julian lunged across the reclaimed wood desk. His hands reached for my throat, knocking the ceramic planter and the legal binders to the floor with a deafening crash. Soil scattered across the hardwood. I did not flinch. I did not even push my chair back. Before Julian's fingers could graze the collar of my shirt, the security contractor closest to the desk moved. The action was swift, clinical, and brutal in its efficiency. The contractor grabbed Julian's outstretched arm, pivoted, and drove his shoulder into Julian's chest. Julian hit the floor hard. The breath left his lungs in a sharp gasp. The second contractor was on him in an instant, pinning his shoulders against the wooden floorboards. They did not strike him. They simply applied overwhelming calculated pressure, locking his joints in place so he could not thrash. Julian laid there, his cheek pressed into the spilled potting soil. He gasped for air, his expensive button-down shirt stained with the dirt he had mocked his entire life. Sienna screamed, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall. She clutched her designer purse to her chest like a shield, trembling uncontrollably. Elias calmly reached down, picked up the silver pen that had rolled off the desk, and placed it back on top of the confession document. He looked down at Julian, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal suit. Assaulting the executor of a trust is a severe miscalculation, Elias noted quietly. I stood up from my chair and walked around the desk. I looked down at my brother, who was staring up at me with eyes full of helpless terror. The power dynamic of the Hayes family had just been permanently rewritten in the dirt of my office floor. I looked at Donovan Reed, the high-priced attorney who was supposed to be their savior. He had his hand on the brass doorknob. "You can leave, Mr. Reed," I said without taking my eyes off Julian. "I suggest you bill your clients up front. They are about to experience a severe liquidity crisis." The lawyer did not say a word. He opened the door, slipped out into the coastal sunlight, and practically sprinted toward the black SUV. The sound of tires spinning on the gravel driveway confirmed his departure. He abandoned them just as quickly as their wealthy friends had. The room fell silent again, save for Julian's labored breathing. He was pinned against the floorboards, a man who had tried to build a kingdom out of lies, finally grounded in cold, hard reality. Sienna continued to weep against the wall, mourning the death of her illusions. Evelyn Hayes had won. She had reached from beyond the grave, using my silence and their arrogance to expose the rot in our bloodline. Elias stepped beside me, looking down at the broken siblings. The 90-day waiting period was effectively over. The trap had snapped shut, breaking every bone in its jaws. Yet the legal architecture of my grandmother's will was not finished dispensing justice. Elias reached into his tailored jacket and produced one final envelope. The silence inside the nursery office was profound. The rhythmic dripping of a loose irrigation valve echoed from the greenhouse, counting the seconds. Julian thrashed against the wooden floorboards of my office. The security contractor shifted his weight, pressing a knee precisely between Julian's shoulder blades, neutralizing the struggle without breaking a single bone. Julian spat a mouthful of potting soil onto the floor. He twisted his neck, his eyes burning with a feverish, cornered desperation. He yelled that he would sue me. He promised to hire a team of ruthless litigators who would drag my name through the courts until I was buried in legal fees. He swore he would take every cent I owned and leave me bankrupt. I sat back in my chair and watched him. He was still playing a game that had ended hours ago. He did not understand that he was threatening a bank with an empty wallet. Elias stood beside my desk. He did not react to the shouting. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and produced one final cream-colored envelope. The seal bore the crest of my grandmother's private legal firm. Evelyn anticipated this exact response, Elias said, his voice easily cutting through Julian's frantic threats. She knew that if her wealth was distributed, the immediate instinct of certain beneficiaries would be to consume more than their allotted share. She understood that entitlement rarely respects boundaries. Elias opened the envelope and extracted a single sheet of heavy parchment. He held it up so Julian could see the dense paragraphs of legal text. "This is the no-contest poison pill," Elias explained. "It is a standard protective measure in high-net-worth estate planning, but Evelyn engineered a highly specific trigger. The clause states that if any beneficiary attempts to legally challenge the autonomy, capacity, or standing of the trust executor, they forfeit their initial inheritance. Filing a predatory conservatorship petition against Adriana constitutes a direct legal contest of her capacity." Julian stopped struggling. The air in the room grew heavy. The security contractor eased his grip just a fraction, allowing Julian to catch his breath. "When you filed those papers in Los Angeles County this morning," Elias continued, "you activated the forfeiture clause. The $4 million Richard transferred to your account at the will reading is no longer classified as an inheritance. By violating the trust conditions, that money is legally reclassified as a callable bridge loan from the estate." I watched the color drain from Julian's face for the second time that day. He was a tech founder. He understood the terminology of venture capital. A callable loan meant the lender could demand full repayment at any time. "The trust is calling the loan," Elias stated with chilling finality. "The principal amount of $4 million plus an accrued penalty interest rate of 20% is due by the close of business today. You do not just have $0, Julian. You are nearly $5 million in debt to your sister. You are officially bankrupt." Sienna let out a sharp gasp from her place against the wall. She looked at Julian pinned to the floor in his ruined designer shirt. Then she looked at the quitclaim deed still resting on my desk. She realized the poison pill applied to her as well. She had her name on that conservatorship petition. If she did not appease the executor immediately, the trust would call back the $3 million she had received money she had already funneled into her failing cosmetics brand and lavish lifestyle. Sienna did not possess loyalty. When we were children, if she broke a vase or ruined a piece of furniture, she would point her finger at Julian before the crash even stopped echoing. Survival was her only instinct. She scrambled up from the floor, clutching her purse. She rushed toward my desk, dodging the spilled soil and the overturned legal binders. She snatched the silver pen. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the metal barrel. She pressed the pen to the quitclaim deed and scribbled her signature across the dotted line. "I am sorry," Sienna whispered, not looking at me. She threw the pen down. "I am so sorry." She did not look at Julian. She did not try to help him up. She surrendered her rights to the Malibu estate, abandoning the only leverage she had left, and bolted for the door. The security guards let her pass. Her high heels clicked frantically against the gravel driveway. Moments later, the engine of the rental SUV roared to life. She left her brother behind in the dirt, fleeing back to Los Angeles to face the wreckage of her influencer empire alone. Julian watched the door close behind her. The fight finally left his body. The delusion of his grand comeback shattered. He was facing federal prison, he owed me $5 million, and his own sister had just stepped over him to save herself. "Let him up," I said. The security contractors stepped back in perfect synchronization. Julian pushed himself up from the floorboards. His knees trembled. He brushed a clump of damp earth from the lapel of his jacket, a futile gesture that only smeared the dirt deeper into the fabric. He looked at the wooden desk. The formal confession of wire fraud sat there waiting for him. He picked up the silver pen. He did not offer any more threats. He did not try to negotiate a better deal. He knew the venture capital board would crucify him. He knew the federal regulators would strip him of everything else. Signing the confession was the only way to retain a shred of dignity and avoid a prolonged public trial that would humiliate him further. Julian signed his name. His signature was sloppy, broken, a stark contrast to the perfect forgery he had crafted on my loan application. He dropped the pen. He looked at me, his eyes hollow and defeated. "You won," he whispered. "This was not a game, Julian," I replied. "I did not win anything. I just survived you." Elias stepped forward and picked up the signed confession. He placed it carefully into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. He gestured toward the front door. "I took the liberty of coordinating with the federal authorities handling your case," Elias told Julian. "They are very eager to review this document." Elias walked out of the office. Through the window, I watched him approach an unmarked gray sedan parked near the edge of the property line. Two men in plain clothes stepped out of the vehicle. Elias handed them a manila folder containing a copy of the confession. The agents nodded, their faces grim, and began walking toward the nursery office to collect Julian. The security guards escorted Julian out to meet them. I did not follow. I stayed in my office listening to the crunch of gravel as they led my brother away. The gray sedan started its engine and drove off down the winding coastal road, disappearing into the afternoon shadows. Elias returned to the office a few minutes later. He dismissed the security team with a nod. They exited through the rear supply room, vanishing as quietly as they had arrived. We were alone in the quiet nursery. Elias checked his silver pocket watch. He looked up at me, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It is exactly 3:00 in the afternoon," Elias announced. "The 90-day waiting period stipulated by your grandmother has officially expired. You upheld the silence clause. You did not warn them, and you allowed their true natures to dictate their outcomes." He placed a small digital token on my desk. "The Evelyn Hayes Irrevocable Trust is now fully unlocked," he said. "The holding companies, the coastal properties, the technology patents, and the offshore liquid assets have cleared the final legal hurdles. $60 million is now registered solely in your name. You are entirely free, Adriana." I reached out and touched the digital token. The plastic was cool and smooth. It did not feel like $60 million. It felt like peace. The suffocating weight I had carried since the will reading in San Francisco evaporated. Julian and Sienna were no longer a threat. They had been neutralized by the very wealth they worshipped. I thanked Elias. We agreed to meet the following week to begin restructuring the trust toward ecological conservation. I spent the next hour sweeping up the spilled potting soil and placing the legal binders into the recycling bin. I locked the doors of the nursery, climbed into my faded Ford pickup, and drove home to my small wooden cabin in the valley. The drive was beautiful. The setting sun painted the coastal clouds in shades of bruised purple and brilliant gold. I felt lighter than I had in years. I thought the war was finally over. I thought the toxic chapter of my family history was closed for good. I pulled my truck onto the dirt driveway of my property. The engine idled. I stared through the windshield, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. Parked next to my front porch was a pristine white luxury sedan. I recognized the license plate. It belonged to my mother. Patricia was sitting on the wooden steps of my cabin. She was wearing a tailored designer coat, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of redwood trees and wild ferns. Her makeup was flawless, but her posture was rigid. She watched my truck approach, her expression unreadable. The siblings were destroyed, but the architect of their entitlement was waiting for me at my own front door. I turned off the engine of my truck. The headlights faded, leaving the dirt driveway bathed in the silver light of the moon. My mother stood up from the wooden steps of my cabin. She smoothed the front of her expensive wool coat. Her presence in Carmel was a jarring anomaly. Patricia did not visit the valley. She considered the Central Coast too rustic, too far removed from the polished circles of Silicon Valley elite. "Why are you here, Mom?" I asked, stepping out of the vehicle and keeping my distance. She looked at the small porch, the humble wooden siding of my home, and then at me. "I am losing my house, Adriana." The bank issued a notice of default this afternoon. Julian used my equity to back his corporate credit lines. When the federal regulators froze his accounts, the commercial lenders came after the guarantors. I am ruined. I did not invite her inside. You co-signed a high-risk bridge loan for a startup. I said, keeping my tone neutral. You bet your house on a phantom public offering. She stepped closer, her eyes flashing with a sudden desperate anger. I backed my son. I backed the family. Now he is sitting in a federal holding cell. Sienna will not return my phone calls, and I am surrounded by cardboard boxes. I drove all the way down here because I need you to see what you have done. Come to Palo Alto tomorrow morning. Look at the destruction you orchestrated. She turned around, walked to her pristine white sedan, and drove away into the night. She wanted an audience for her martyrdom. She wanted me to stand in the ruins of her social standing and feel guilty. The next morning, I made the drive north for the final time. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Palo Alto enclave. The neighborhood was quiet, insulated by manicured hedges and wealth. But Patricia's driveway was a scene of frantic dismantling. 2 large moving trucks were parked on the cobblestones. Men in gray uniforms were carrying out leather sofas, antique dining chairs, and wrapped oil paintings. The illusion of the Hayes dynasty was being boxed up and loaded into freight compartments. I walked through the double doors. The cavernous foyer echoed with the sound of packing tape ripping off plastic dispensers. Patricia stood in the center of the formal living room. She was directing the movers, pointing a shaking finger at a collection of crystal vases. She wore a dark silk blouse, trying to maintain a facade of authority, but her face was gaunt. The stress of the past 24 hours had aged her a decade. She saw me standing in the entryway and dismissed the movers with a wave of her hand. We were left alone in a room stripped of its luxury, reduced to bare hardwood floors and echoes. I am glad you came, Patricia said, her voice tight and trembling. I want you to look at this. The bank gives me 3 days to vacate the premises before they change the locks. The country club suspended my membership this morning because the automatic dues bounced. My friends are treating me like a contagion. She walked toward me, crossing her arms. How could you be so cruel, Adriana? We are your flesh and blood. You have $60 million sitting in an offshore account. You could have written a single check and saved this house. You could have saved Julian from prison. You could have paid Sienna's fines. Instead, you stood back and let the federal government tear your own family to pieces. She waited for me to lower my head. She expected the old version of me, the quiet daughter who absorbed the blame to keep the peace. She expected me to apologize for surviving. I looked at the empty spaces where her expensive furniture used to sit. I did not feel guilt. I felt a profound sense of clarity. I did not force Julian to forge loan documents. I said, my voice steady and quiet. I did not force Sienna to poison her customers with cheap cosmetics. And I did not force you to sign away the equity of this house to fund a fraudulent tech company. Patricia's eyes widened. She tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. You sat at that table in San Francisco, I continued. You watched the lawyer hand me a yellow envelope. You smiled while Julian mocked my clothing. You offered me $500 for groceries while you celebrated their millions. You knew they drove here yesterday with a predatory lawyer to steal my autonomy and lock me in a psychiatric facility. You knew what they were planning and you did nothing to stop it. I did not know they were going to do that, Patricia stammered, taking a step backward. Her voice lost its righteous edge, replaced by a hollow panic. I just thought they were going to ask you for a loan. You always look the other way when it serves your narrative, Mom, I replied. You raised 2 people who view everyone around them as transactions. You fed their entitlement. You covered their mistakes. You raised sharks, Mom. You just did not expect them to eat you. Patricia covered her mouth with her hand. A sob tore through her throat. It was not a performative cry like Sienna's. It was the raw, ugly sound of a woman realizing her entire identity had been repossessed. She sank onto a half-taped moving box, her shoulders shaking. Please, Adriana, she wept. I have nowhere to go. The creditors are freezing my personal accounts. I cannot rent an apartment with my credit score. I'm going to end up on the street. Just pay off the mortgage. I will sign the house over to you. You can own it. Just let me stay here. Let me keep my life. She was bargaining. She was offering me the deed to a house I did not want in a neighborhood I despised just to maintain her proximity to power. I will not pay your debts, I said. That is my final boundary. You will not see a single dollar from Evelyn's trust. Patricia looked up, her face streaked with tears and ruined makeup. Then what am I supposed to do? I reached into the pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a heavy brass key attached to a simple leather ring. I walked across the bare hardwood floor and placed the key on the cardboard box next to her. This morning, I authorized Elias to purchase a property in Sacramento, I explained. It is a modest 2-bedroom condominium. It is quiet. It is safe. The deed is held in a separate locked trust. You can live there rent-free for the rest of your life. The trust will cover the property taxes and the basic utilities. Patricia stared at this brass key. Sacramento. It was 2 hours away from the coast, far removed from the social registers of Palo Alto and the elite galas of San Francisco. It was a comfortable working-class city. To her, it was a banishment. I do not own it, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. No, I said. You have a roof over your head, but you have no access to the principal. You cannot borrow against it. You cannot sell it. You have exactly what you need to survive, but you no longer have the resources to pretend you are royalty. She looked at the key, then up at me. The humiliation in her eyes was deep and agonizing. She was being downgraded, forced to live the kind of quiet, unremarkable life she had spent her entire adulthood running away from. She wanted to throw the key back at me. She wanted to curse my name and demand her mansion. But she had no other choice. The moving trucks were waiting outside. The bank was closing in. Patricia reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the key. She closed her fingers around the brass metal, lowering her head in total defeat. She did not say thank you. She did not need to. The silence was the most honest exchange we had ever shared. I turned around and walked toward the entryway. I did not look back. I stepped out of the double doors, leaving the sprawling Palo Alto mansion behind me. The coastal breeze carried the scent of eucalyptus and exhaust from the moving trucks. I walked down the cobblestone driveway and climbed into my truck. I put the key in the ignition and started the engine. The sound was loud and grounding. I drove out through the wrought iron gates. The toxicity of the Hayes family was finally contained. Julian was facing a judge. Sienna was facing the wreckage of her vanity. Patricia was facing reality. The ledger was balanced. I merged onto the highway, heading south toward the ocean. The afternoon sun reflected off the hood of my truck. My phone vibrated on the passenger seat. I glanced at the screen. It was a text message from Elias Cole. There was no greeting. There were no attachments. There was only one sentence. The Malibu demolition is approved. The coastal wind in Malibu carries a distinct scent. It is a sharp mixture of salt spray and the dry chaparral of the Santa Monica Mountains. I stood on a ridge overlooking the Pacific Ocean, breathing in that air while the ground vibrated beneath my boots. Down below on the property that once belonged to my sister, 2 heavy yellow bulldozers roared to life. Sienna had designed the mansion to be a monument to her own vanity. It was a sprawling multi-level structure of imported glass and white stucco that looked entirely unnatural against the rugged California coastline. It was a house built for photographs, not for living. And now the heavy steel treads of the demolition crew were tearing it apart. I watched the first bucket swing forward, smashing through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand living room where Sienna had filmed her lifestyle videos. The glass shattered, catching the morning sunlight like diamonds before falling into the debris. The walls buckled inward, sending up a thick plume of white dust. The physical destruction of the house felt like the final necessary step in dismantling the illusion my family had spent decades cultivating. Elias stood a few feet away, holding a thermos of coffee. He watched the demolition with the practiced neutrality of a man who had seen empires rise and fall before breakfast. The demolition permits cleared faster than expected, Elias noted, taking a sip of his coffee. The local zoning board was surprisingly cooperative once we submitted the environmental impact reports. They are cooperative because we are not building another glass box, I replied, watching a load-bearing beam snap in half. My grandmother Evelyn had bought this specific parcel of land 30 years ago. She had not purchased it to build a vacation home. Long before Julian became obsessed with venture capital, and long before Sienna started chasing digital fame, Evelyn had been a quietly passionate amateur botanist. She had spent her weekends hiking the coastal trails, identifying rare native succulents and scrub oak. She had always spoken of building a sanctuary, a place dedicated to the preservation of California's fragile coastal ecosystem. But as the family grew and the demands for social status escalated, she had shelved the project. The land had become just another asset on a spreadsheet. I was pulling it off the spreadsheet. Using the capital unlocked from the trust, I was breaking ground on the Evelyn Hayes Coastal Conservatory. It would not be a private estate. It would be a state-of-the-art research facility and a protected botanical reserve open to universities and ecological scientists. We were restoring the cliffs to their natural state, erasing the gaudy footprint of my sister's ambition and replacing it with something rooted and permanent. The contrast between my new reality and the fate of my siblings was stark. The justice system moves slowly, but when it finally strikes, the impact is absolute. Julian did not go to trial. His high-priced defense attorneys reviewed the forged loan application, the financial records Elias had provided, and the testimonies of the venture capital board. They told Julian the truth. If he fought the charges in federal court, he would likely receive a 20-year sentence. The evidence was insurmountable. Julian took a plea deal. The man who had stood in a Michelin-starred restaurant and declared he would soon be a billionaire was now an inmate. He received a 5-year sentence in a minimum security federal penitentiary in Nevada. The court stripped him of his remaining assets to pay restitution to his defrauded investors. The tech startup he had sacrificed his morality to save was dismantled and sold off in pieces by a bankruptcy trustee. He was left with nothing but a gray uniform and the agonizing realization that his arrogance had engineered his own cage. Sienna's descent was less structured by the courts but equally devastating. When the news of the ground lease eviction and the federal cosmetic fine broke, her carefully curated world abandoned her. Her wealthy husband, a commercial real estate broker who valued optics above all else, filed for divorce within a month. He cited irreconcilable differences, but everyone in their social circle knew he was simply cutting his losses before her financial toxicity ruined his own credit rating. Sienna moved out of the Malibu house 2 days before the eviction deadline, packing her designer clothes into rented moving boxes. Her sponsors terminated her contracts. Her follower count plummeted as the cosmetic scandal dominated the beauty blogs. She was left with massive legal debts and zero income. I received an update from Elias regarding her whereabouts a few weeks prior. Sienna, the woman who had mocked my dirt-stained hands, was now working as a shift manager at a high-end retail boutique in a luxury outdoor mall in Orange County. She spent her days folding cashmere sweaters and smiling at wealthy women who treated her with the exact same dismissive arrogance she had once directed at me. She was trapped in the retail trenches of the lifestyle she used to rule. As the second bulldozer tore down the master suite of the Malibu house, I realized how profoundly peaceful my own life had become. I had $60 million, but my daily routine had barely changed. I did not purchase a mega yacht. I did not buy a fleet of exotic cars. I did not upgrade my wardrobe to designer labels. I still drove my faded Ford pickup. I still lived in my small wooden cabin in the Carmel Valley. What the money provided was not luxury. It provided oxygen. I used a fraction of the trust to purchase the 30 acres of undeveloped land adjacent to my nursery. I expanded my greenhouses. I hired a team of 5 passionate, highly educated botanists who shared my vision for coastal restoration. I paid them excellent salaries, provided full health benefits, and gave them the resources they needed to conduct real, meaningful research. I spent my mornings reviewing architectural plans for the new conservatory with Elias, and I spent my afternoons with my hands in the dirt propagating rare native species. The wealth did not change my identity. It amplified it. It gave me the power to build a fortress around the life I had always wanted, protecting my peace from the chaos of the outside world. The final wall of this Malibu house collapsed inward, sending a shockwave through the ground. The dust cloud billowed out over the cliff, catching the coastal wind and drifting out toward the ocean. The structure was gone. The land was bare. "It is going to take 6 months to clear the debris and grade the soil," Elias said, checking a timeline on his tablet. "The architects can begin laying the foundation for the research center by early spring." "Take all the time you need," I replied, turning away from the ridge. "We are building this to last." I walked back to my truck, the sound of the demolition fading behind me. The narrative of the Hayes family, defined for so long by greed and superficiality, had been successfully rewritten. I had survived the public executions, the midnight threats, and the legal ambushes. I had watched the architects of my misery destroy themselves. I was ready to close the book on them and focus entirely on the future. But the past rarely stays buried without a fight. A week later, the tranquil rhythm of my life in Carmel was interrupted. I was in the newly expanded greenhouse demonstrating a grafting technique to one of my junior botanists. The heavy wooden door of the main office swung open, the small brass bell chiming sharply. I wiped the soil from my hands and walked into the front room, expecting a delivery driver or a local client. Instead, standing near the reception desk, looking entirely out of place amidst the terracotta pots and bags of organic fertilizer, was a man in a dark suit. He did not look like a private security contractor, and he did not carry the polished arrogance of a corporate lawyer. He held a thick manila envelope in his left hand. "Adriana Hayes." The man asked, his voice flat and authoritative. "Yes," I replied, feeling a sudden, inexplicable tension tighten in my chest. He stepped forward and extended the manila envelope. "You have been formally served," he said. I did not reach for the envelope immediately. "Served with what?" "The trust is sealed. Julian is in prison." Sienna signed the quitclaim. The man dropped the envelope onto the counter. "It is a civil summons," he stated. I stared at the thick package resting on the wood. "Who is suing me?" The man turned toward the door. "The plaintiff is Patricia Hayes," he said without looking back. "She is contesting the terms of the Sacramento Trust and alleging elder financial abuse. You have 20 days to respond." The door closed behind him, the brass bell chiming again, leaving me alone with the realization that a mother's desperation is far more dangerous than a sibling's greed. The civil summons from my mother arrived with a roar, but ended with a whisper. Her attempt to sue me for elder financial abuse was a desperate hollow fabrication born from the panic of her new reality. The California courts require evidence of coercion and actual damages to dismantle a trust. Patricia had nothing but her own regret and a bruised ego. Elias took the manila envelope, filed a motion for summary dismissal, and presented the judge with the immaculate, impenetrable ledgers of my grandmother's estate. The judge threw the case out within 3 weeks. Patricia did not appeal. She stayed in her modest Sacramento condominium, contained by the boundaries I had set, learning to navigate a world where her last name carried no currency. With the final legal threat neutralized, the seasons turned. The dust over Malibu settled. 1 year later, a cool ocean breeze swept across the cliffs where my sister's gaudy mansion used to stand. In its place rose the Evelyn Hayes Coastal Conservatory. The structure did not fight the landscape, it mirrored it. We built the facility using reclaimed redwood native stone and expansive panes of non-reflective glass designed to prevent bird strikes. The roof was a living tapestry of drought-resistant succulents. It looked as though the building had grown directly out of the Santa Monica Mountains, an organic extension of the coastal ridge. The grand opening was held on a Tuesday morning. There were no press releases. There were no red carpets, velvet ropes, or luxury brand sponsors. I did not invite socialites or lifestyle influencers. The guest list consisted of marine biologists, university researchers, local environmental activists, and the construction crew who had poured the foundation. We served coffee from a local roaster and pastries from a family-owned bakery down the highway. The air buzzed with genuine conversation about soil erosion, aquifer restoration, and native seed banks. Elias Cole stood near the entrance of the main research laboratory. He wore a lighter gray suit today, looking more like a proud academic dean than a ruthless corporate wealth manager. Over the past 12 months, our professional relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship. He had guided me through the complex web of offshore accounts and tax structures, teaching me how to wield my inheritance like a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. Around noon, the crowd gathered in the central atrium. Sunlight poured through the skylights, illuminating a towering interior display of California sycamore trees. I stepped up to a simple wooden podium. I did not hold note cards. I looked at the faces of the people who had dedicated their lives to preserving the earth, and I spoke from the heart. My grandmother built an empire in boardrooms, I told the crowd, my voice echoing lightly against the stone walls. But her peace was always found on these cliffs. She understood that real wealth is not measured by the things we can hoard, but by the ecosystems we can sustain. She bought this land decades ago with a vision. Today we are fulfilling that promise. This conservatory is dedicated to Evelyn Hayes and to every scientist and student who works to ensure this coastline endures for the next generation. The applause was warm and respectful. There was no performative cheering. People raised their coffee cups, nodded, and returned to their conversations. I stepped down from the podium feeling a profound sense of closure. The heavy mantle of the Hayes family legacy had finally been repurposed into something beautiful. I walked through the crowd, thanking the lead architects and shaking hands with the visiting professors. As I made my way toward the rear botanical gardens, seeking a moment of quiet away from the chatter, a solitary figure caught my eye. Someone was lingering near the edge of the property, standing by a newly planted row of coastal sage scrub. The person was not wearing the casual hiking gear or tweed jackets favored by the researchers. She wore a uniform. It was a simple navy blue polo shirt tucked into dark slacks paired with sensible rubber-soled shoes. A plastic name tag was pinned to her chest. I stopped on the gravel path. It was Sienna. She did not look like the woman who had signed the quit-claim deed in my office a year ago. The glossy, meticulously styled hair was tied back in a plain, functional ponytail. Her face was devoid of the heavy contouring and bright cosmetics that had defined her online persona. The designer sunglasses were gone, revealing dark circles under her eyes. She looked exhausted, weathered by the relentless demands of an hourly wage and a schedule she did not control. I walked toward her, my footsteps crunching softly on the crushed granite path. She heard my approach and turned around. She did not flinch. She did not raise her chin in defiance. She just stood there, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her retail uniform. "I did not mean to intrude," Sienna said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the vocal fry and artificial brightness she used to project. I read about the opening on a local community board. I parked down the road and walked up. I just wanted to see it. I stopped a few feet away from her. I looked at her hands. The pristine acrylic manicures were gone. Her nails were cut short, the cuticles dry. It was the physical toll of unboxing inventory, breaking down cardboard, and standing on her feet for 9 hours a day in an Orange County retail store. "You are welcome to walk the grounds," I said, keeping my tone measured. Sienna turned her gaze back to the conservatory. The wood and glass structure gleamed in the midday sun. The ocean crashed against the rocks far below us. "Grandma would have loved this," Sienna whispered. She traced the edge of a sage leaf with her bare finger. "She always hated the house I built here. She told me once that it looked like a tombstone. I was so angry at her for saying that, but she was right." She turned to look at me. Her eyes were clear. The frantic, desperate energy that had consumed her during her financial collapse had burned away. What remained was a humbled, tired human being who was finally living in the real world. "I am sorry, Adriana," she said, holding my gaze without wavering. "I am sorry for the things I said to you. I am sorry for the conservatorship petition. I am sorry it took losing everything for me to realize how empty I was. Truly." She did not follow the apology with a request. She did not ask for a loan. She did not ask me to buy her a condo or pay off her residual legal debts. She just offered the words and let them sit in the air between us. I studied her face. Forgiveness is a complex architecture. It is not a switch you can flip simply because someone finally says the right words. Trust requires a foundation built over time, and ours had been bulldozed down to the bedrock. I was not ready to invite her into my home, and I was not ready to call her my sister again. "It is a start, Sienna," I replied softly. She nodded. She understood the boundary, and she accepted it. She offered a small, hesitant smile, then turned and began walking back down the long dirt road leading to the highway. I watched her go. The posture of the woman walking away was entirely different from the influencer who used to strut through life expecting the world to bow. Stripping away the family wealth was the only thing that could ever force them to become human. The money had acted as a toxic sealant, preserving their worst traits and insulating them from consequence. Without it, Sienna was forced to feel the gravity of her actions. She was forced to earn her survival. I turned back toward the conservatory. My internal state felt like a still, deep lake. I had fully embraced my role. I was not a billionaire heiress treating the world like a personal playground. I was a steward. The $60 million resting in the trust was not my identity. It was simply the fertilizer required to grow this sanctuary and protect my peace. I had a thriving nursery in Carmel. I had a team of brilliant scientists working on this ridge. I was exactly where I belonged. I walked back into the main atrium. The crowd had started to thin as the catered lunch wound down. Elias was waiting for me near the entrance of my new administrative office. He held his familiar leather briefcase, his expression shifting from the relaxed demeanor of a party guest back to the sharp focus of a legal advisor. "It was a beautiful speech," Adriana, Elias said as I approached. "Evelyn would be deeply proud of what you have built here." "Thank you, Elias. I think she would be too." We stepped into the quiet office and closed the door behind us, muting the lingering conversations from the hallway. Elias set his briefcase on the desk and unfastened the brass locks. "We have our routine quarterly review scheduled for tomorrow," Elias noted, reaching into the leather compartments. "But I received a piece of correspondence this morning that requires your immediate instruction." He pulled out a standard white postal envelope. The paper looked thin and cheap. There was no elegant crest or embossed return address. The postmark stamped across the top right corner indicated it had been processed through the federal penitentiary system in Nevada. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the same jagged, aggressive script that had forged my signature on the commercial loan application. "It is from your brother," Elias said, holding the envelope out to me. The peace of the afternoon fractured just a fraction. Julian had been locked away for a year, isolated from the world he once tried to conquer. He had lost his company, his freedom, and his pride, and now he was trying to reach out across the razor wire. The autumn rains arrived early in Carmel, bringing a crisp, clean chill to the coastal valley. My nursery office was warm, filled with the scent of damp earth and cedar. The space had changed significantly over the past year. The old, flickering fluorescent light was gone, replaced by natural spectrum bulbs that nourished the indoor seedlings. The walls, once bare, were now lined with architectural blueprints of the conservatory and detailed topographical maps of the Malibu cliffs. Yet my desk remained the same. I kept the reclaimed wood surface as a reminder of where I started long before the inheritance rewrote my reality. Elias Cole sat across from me, looking entirely at ease in his tailored suit despite the rustic surroundings. He opened a thick leather-bound portfolio. He did not bring digital tablets to our meetings. He preferred the permanence of ink on heavy paper, a habit he had inherited from his years working alongside my grandmother. He traced a column of numbers with the tip of his silver pen. "The trust has appreciated by 12% over the past 3 quarters, Elias noted, his voice carrying a note of quiet satisfaction. I leaned over the desk, reading the itemized returns. 12% was a staggering figure given the conservative nature of our recent maneuvers. When I assumed control of the holding companies, my first directive was to liquidate the volatile software equities Julian had favored. I spent my evenings studying tax law and corporate governance, refusing to be a passive beneficiary. We diverted that capital into municipal water infrastructure bonds and sustainable agricultural technologies. It was a strategy based on slow, deep-root growth rather than rapid, unstable expansion. "You navigated the market correction perfectly," I said, reviewing the final balance sheet. The philanthropic tax shelters protecting the core 60 million are operating exactly as intended. You provided the vision, Elias replied, closing the financial ledger. I merely executed the architecture. You speak this language fluently now, Adriana. Evelyn would be formidable if she saw you today. He moved the heavy ledger to the side. Beneath it rested a thin, plain white folder. The shift in his posture told me we were moving from corporate governance to personal business. Before we conclude today, Elias said, folding his hands on the desk, I need to update you on the perimeter checks. Your mother attempted to contact my firm twice last week. She wanted to file a formal complaint regarding the homeowner association rules at her Sacramento condominium. She feels the landscaping guidelines are too restrictive. I shook my head, staring out the window at the falling rain. Route her complaints to a junior clerk, I instructed. She has a roof over her head. Her disputes with the neighborhood committee are not my concern. Already handled, Elias confirmed. As for Sienna, she has maintained total silence. She has not made a single attempt to petition the estate or contact our offices. She appears to be focusing entirely on her retail employment in Orange County. That left one remaining variable. Elias opened the plain white folder. He extracted a single standard postal envelope. The paper looked cheap, lacking the elegant crest or embossed return address my family usually demanded. The postmark stamped across the top right corner indicated it had been processed through the federal penitentiary system in Nevada. It is from your brother, Elias said, holding the envelope out to me. It cleared the prison screening facility 4 days ago. The peace of the morning fractured just a fraction. Julian had been locked away for a year, isolated from the world he once tried to conquer. He had lost his company, his freedom, and his pride. And now he was trying to reach out across the razor wire. I took the envelope. I pulled the single sheet of lined paper from inside. Julian's handwriting had changed. The sharp, arrogant strokes that once forged my signature on commercial bank loans were gone. The letters were smaller, now cramped and uneven. It was the script of a man writing from a small metal desk in a shared cell, stripped of his ergonomic chairs and glass-walled corner offices. Dear Adriana, the letter began. I have had a lot of time to reflect in here. The environment is harsh. They have me working in the laundry facility managing inventory schedules. It is tedious, but it keeps my mind occupied. I read further down the page, waiting for the apology. I waited for an acknowledgement of the conservatorship petition, or the attempt to steal my land, or the lies he fed our mother. The apology never came. Instead, the letter pivoted into a winding, self-pitying defense. Julian wrote about the unique pressures of the technology sector. He claimed the venture capitalists had created an impossible standard of growth. He framed his wire fraud not as a calculated crime, but as a desperate survival tactic in a cutthroat culture. He was a victim of the algorithm, a casualty of the Silicon Valley machine. He took zero accountability for his own choices. Then, in the third paragraph, he arrived at his true purpose. I have been reading about your new conservatory in the trade magazines the prison library receives, Julian wrote. It looks like a substantial operation. When my sentence is up in 4 years, you are going to need an experienced executive to handle the logistics and the corporate partnerships. I know we have had our differences, but I am still your brother. I can help you scale this project. Keep a management position open for me. I stopped reading. The sheer blinding entitlement radiating from the page was staggering. He still believed he was superior. He still believed my work was a hobby that required his corporate genius to legitimize it. He thought 4 years in a federal facility would serve as a reset button, wiping the slate clean without requiring an ounce of actual repentance. He wanted to walk out of a prison cell and directly into a corner office funded by the very sister he tried to institutionalize. I stood up from my desk. I did not crumple the paper. I did not throw it against the wall or yell in frustration. Anger is an emotion reserved for people who still hold power over you. Julian held no power. He was just a ghost rattling chains from a cage he built himself. I walked over to the corner of the office where we kept an industrial paper shredder for sensitive financial documents. I flipped the power switch. The machine hummed to life with a low, mechanical growl. I fed the lined paper into the metal teeth. The shredder caught the edge, pulling the letter downward and slicing Julian's excuses into hundreds of unreadable ribbons. I dropped the cheap envelope in right behind it. I watched the pieces fall into the plastic bin, mixing with old invoices and discarded seed catalogs. Elias watched me from the desk, his expression unreadable, but his eyes tracking my every movement. Draft a legal injunction. I instructed Elias, turning back to face him. Contact the warden of his facility today. I want all future correspondence blocked. Return to sender. If he attempts to use a proxy, file a harassment claim immediately. Elias closed the personal file, resting his hands flat on top of the leather portfolio. That is a permanent measure, Adriana. Once we file the injunction, the state will recognize it as a hard barrier. Love and access are not the same thing, I replied, walking back and sitting down in my chair. He can call himself my brother all he wants, but he lost access to my life the day he walked into this nursery and tried to steal my mind. He is not looking for redemption. He is looking for a new host to drain. The door is locked. Elias allowed a rare, genuine smile to break across his face. He recognized the tone. It was the same unwavering spine Evelyn used to command boardrooms. He admired the ruthless clarity of the boundary. In the world of wealth management, sentimental weakness was the fastest route to ruin. I possessed none. The legal loose ends are officially tied, Elias stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. The holding company is a fortress. The assets are secured behind multiple layers of blind trusts. Your mother is contained in Sacramento, your sister is managing her own retail shifts, and your brother is walled off by federal regulations and our own legal boundaries. You are untouchable. I looked out the window of the nursery. The morning rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the coastal clouds, casting long golden shadows across the rows of propagated oak saplings. I had not just won a game of inheritance. I had mastered the rules of engagement. I had taken the toxic, tangled root system of the Hayes family and severed the disease branches with surgical precision. I possessed long-term, unshakable security. But security is just a foundation. The absence of conflict is not the same thing as the presence of purpose. I had spent the last year dismantling the threats against my life-building walls and preparing for war. Now that the battlefield was silent, a new kind of challenge emerged. I had to figure out how to live in the fortress I had built without turning it into a prison of my own making. The weeks following Elias's visit settled into a deep, predictable rhythm. The threat of my brother reaching across the walls of a federal penitentiary had been neutralized by a single sheet of shredded paper and a swift legal injunction. The fortress I built around my life was finally secure, impenetrable from the outside. Yet absolute security creates its own strange vacuum. When you spend your entire adult life bracing for impact, the absence of an enemy leaves the air feeling hollow. I sat at my desk looking at an email glowing on my laptop screen. It was not a threat from a predatory lawyer or a desperate demand from a bankrupt sibling. The sender was a senior editor at Forbes magazine. The email outlined a proposed feature article for their upcoming issue on the new generation of American philanthropy. They had traced the funding of the Evelyn Hayes Coastal Conservatory back to a single anonymous blind trust, and through a series of diligent public record searches, they had connected the dots to my small nursery in Carmel. The editor wanted an exclusive interview. He promised a multi-page spread, professional photography, and a prominent position on the digital homepage. A year ago, Julian would have severed his own arm for an email like this. He would have hired a public relations firm, bought a new designer suit, and rehearsed talking points designed to project maximum visionary genius. Sienna would have leveraged the exposure to demand millions in new brand sponsorships. I looked at the email for exactly 30 seconds. Then I hit the delete key and closed the laptop. I walked out of my office and into the cool, damp air of the main greenhouse. My lead botanist, a brilliant woman named Clara, who had joined my team right after the trust unlocked, was standing near a raised bed of Monterey cypress saplings. The Monterey cypress is a notoriously stubborn species, requiring a highly specific balance of coastal fog, acidic soil, and punishing wind to thrive. I rolled up the sleeves of my flannel shirt, knelt beside Clara, and plunged my hands into the soil. "You rejected the magazine," Clara guessed, observing my focus as I carefully loosened the root ball of a fragile sapling. "I prefer the dirt," I replied, packing the dark earth around the base of the tiny tree. My reality had shifted, but my identity remained stubbornly rooted. I was not a billionaire heiress playing at philanthropy. I was a gardener who had inherited a very large shovel. The contrast between the life I had chosen and the lives my family had chased was stark. I received periodic unsolicited updates about Patricia through the Sacramento Neighborhood Association. The condominium trust required regular check-ins to ensure the property was maintained. The property manager reported that my mother spent her days attending local book clubs and volunteering at a suburban arts council. She complained constantly to her new neighbors about the heat and the lack of high-end dining options, clinging to the fading echoes of her Palo Alto glory days. But she was safe. She had a roof over her head, her utility bills were paid, and she was shielded from the ruthless financial predators who had dismantled her son. She had found a comfortable, if resentful, mediocrity. Sienna was a ghost. She maintained zero digital footprint. The influencer who had once broadcasted her breakfast routines to millions of strangers had vanished into the analog reality of a retail shift manager. And Julian remained locked behind a chain-link fence in the Nevada desert, managing inventory schedules for prison laundry detergent. People always ask the same question when they hear stories about sudden, unearned wealth. They ask if the money fixed everything. They assume that holding a piece of paper worth $60 million instantly cures anxiety, mends broken families, and provides a permanent shield against sadness. It does not. Money is not a cure. Money is just a magnifying glass. It takes whatever you already are at your core and makes you massive. If you are insecure and desperate for validation, sudden wealth will amplify your vanity until you are suffocated by it. If you are a liar, the money will give you the resources to build a fraud so large, it requires federal intervention to tear down. My brother was a fraud long before he inherited $4 million. The inheritance just gave him the capital he needed to commit a felony. My sister was hollow, substituting expensive objects for a personality. The money just gave her enough rope to hang herself on a ground lease she could not afford. My mother valued optics above loyalty. The money just exposed the fact that she would sacrifice her own daughter to maintain a lie. I was a gardener. The money did not make me a corporate titan. It did not make me a socialite. It just let me plant a much bigger forest. The nursery in Carmel expanded organically. I did not rely on the trust to float the business. We secured commercial contracts because my team delivered flawless ecological restoration. We won civic awards for our drought mitigation strategies. I was respected by my peers, not because they suspected I had a secret offshore bank account, but because my hands were calloused and my methods worked. The conservatory on the Malibu cliffs thrived. By its second year of operation, the research facility hosted 3 full-time marine biology teams studying kelp forest degradation. The native seed bank we established became a crucial resource for the entire state of California during wildfire recovery efforts. Evelyn Hayes had envisioned a sanctuary, and the reality had exceeded her wildest blueprints. But a life built entirely on defense is not a complete life. The fortress I constructed to keep Julian and Sienna out was flawless, but it also kept the world at a calculated distance. I spent my days working alongside my team and my evenings alone in my wooden cabin. I trusted Elias implicitly with my financial structure, and I trusted Clara with the botanical operations, but I rarely allowed anyone past the professional perimeter. I had learned the hard way that proximity invited betrayal. One evening in late November, the coastal wind was howling through the Carmel Valley, rattling the window panes of my cabin. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing a dense soil analysis report for a new coastal restoration project. The warmth of the wood stove filled the small room, a sharp contrast to the biting cold outside. My cell phone vibrated on the table. The screen illuminated, displaying an incoming call from an unknown number. I normally ignored unknown callers, assuming they were journalists or aggressive real estate brokers trying to buy my nursery land. But something about the timing, the late hour, made me pause. I set down my pen and picked up the phone. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Is this Adriana Hayes?" a woman asked. Her tone was sharp professional and slightly strained, lacking the polished cadence of a reporter. Speaking, I replied. "My name is Dr. Aris Thorne. I am the chief of surgery at San Francisco General Hospital. We are calling regarding a patient who was brought into our emergency department an hour ago." I frowned, my grip tightening on the phone. "I do not understand. My family members are accounted for, and none of them live in San Francisco." The doctor paused. The background noise on her end was chaotic, the distinct, urgent hum of a trauma ward. "The patient is not a member of your family, Ms. Hayes." "Then why are you calling me at 9:00 at night?" I asked, the confusion hardening into caution. "Because you are the only emergency contact listed in his file," Dr. Thorne stated flatly. "The patient is Elias Cole. He was involved in a severe multi-vehicle collision on the Golden Gate Bridge. He is currently in critical condition, and we need an authorized medical proxy immediately." I did not pack a bag. I grabbed my keys, locked the heavy wooden door of my cabin, and drove my Ford pickup into the teeth of the coastal storm. The rain lashed against the windshield in relentless sheets. The drive up the highway to San Francisco usually offered stunning views of the Pacific, but tonight it was just a black void. San Francisco General Hospital smelled of iodine and stale coffee. I bypassed the main triage desk and navigated the sterile corridors until I reached the surgical intensive care unit. Dr. Aris Thorne was waiting near a set of double doors. She wore blue scrubs holding a digital tablet. Her expression carried the professional detachment required to deliver terrible news. "He suffered severe blunt force trauma and multiple compound fractures," Dr. Thorne explained, swiping through a series of radiographic scans. A commercial delivery truck crossed the center median and struck his sedan. "We stabilized his breathing, but there is a complex thoracic hemorrhage. We need to perform an emergency vascular graft. The procedure is high risk. The hospital administration requires the designated proxy to sign a sweeping liability waiver before I can assemble the surgical team." Before I could reach for the electronic stylus, a man stepped out of the adjacent waiting room. He wore a tailored wool suit that looked pristine despite the late hour. His name was Gregory Pierce. He was a senior partner at the wealth management firm Elias founded. I recognized his face from a corporate dossier Elias had shown me months prior. Gregory was a man who treated tragedy as a transaction. "You are not signing anything," Ms. Hayes Gregory said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "I have already contacted the hospital legal department. Elias is a pragmatic man. He would not want heroic experimental measures that risk leaving him incapacitated. As his primary business partner, I am filing an emergency injunction to halt this surgery until a judge can review the validity of your proxy designation tomorrow morning." I looked at Gregory. I understood his motive instantly. If Elias survived but remained incapacitated, Elias could retain his voting rights within their corporate structure. If Elias died on the table tonight, his equity in the firm would automatically transfer to the surviving partners. Gregory was not trying to protect his friend. He was trying to inherit a financial empire by letting a man bleed to death. It was the exact same venom that infected Julian and Sienna dressed in a better suit. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with him about morality. I turned to Dr. Thorne. "Give us 2 minutes," I requested. The doctor nodded and stepped through the double doors. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and opened the secure application Elias had built for me. I pulled up the commercial real estate deeds managed by the Evelyn Hayes Trust. "Your firm operates out of a high-rise in the financial district," I said, keeping my eyes on the screen. "Did you know the ground lease for that building was purchased by a blind holding company 3 years ago?" Gregory frowned, crossing his arms. "That is irrelevant." "It is highly relevant," I replied, looking up to meet his gaze, "because I own that holding company. I also hold a controlling interest in the offshore server farm that stores your client data. If you file that injunction, I will terminate your commercial lease by sunrise. I will seize your servers pending a forensic audit. By the time the judge wakes up tomorrow, your firm will be homeless, paralyzed, and under federal investigation. Gregory stared at me. The smug authority evaporated from his face. He was used to dealing with grieving relatives who crumbled under legal jargon. He did not expect to face the ghost of Evelyn Hayes standing in a hospital corridor. "Drop the injunction," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, "or I will bury you." Gregory swallowed hard. He did not say another word. He turned on his heel and walked toward the elevator bank, abandoning his hostile takeover. I motioned for Dr. Thorne to return. I signed the digital waiver. The surgical doors swung open and they rushed Elias into the operating theater. I sat in the plastic waiting room chair for 9 hours. I watched the sun rise over the San Francisco skyline, casting a gray, muted light through the rain-streaked windows. At 8 in the morning, Dr. Thorne emerged. She looked exhausted, but offered a brief nod. Elias had survived the graft. He was in recovery. 3 days later, I sat in a private recovery suite. The rhythmic beep of a heart monitor filled the room. Elias lay in the hospital bed, pale and bruised, but his eyes were sharp. "You handled Gregory exactly as I hoped you would." Elias rasped, his voice weak but laced with quiet pride. I poured him a small cup of water. "Why am I your proxy, Elias? You have a firm full of partners. You have a vast network of associates. Why list a gardener in Carmel to make your life or death decisions?" Elias took a slow sip of water. "I grew up in the foster system, Adriana. I do not have a family. I spent my entire career building fortresses for other people. I watched siblings destroy each other for real estate. I watched children drug their parents for stock options. I guarded their wealth, but I never trusted them." He rested his head back against the pillow. "When your grandmother hired me, she told me you were different. I spent the last year watching you navigate the trap she built. You did not consume the power, you redirected it. You are the only person I know who understands the burden of protecting a legacy without letting it corrupt you." Elias gestured toward a leather briefcase resting on the visitor chair. "The collision on the bridge was not an accident," he said quietly. "The mechanic found tampering on my brake lines." Gregory grew impatient. He knew I was preparing to step down. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "What are you going to do?" "I am retiring," Elias said, "and I am transferring my ownership stake of the firm directly into your holding company. The paperwork is in the briefcase. You are no longer just managing your grandmother's estate, Adriana. You now control the firm that manages the wealth of the most powerful families on the West Coast." I looked at the briefcase. The magnitude of his decision settled over me. I had successfully walled off the toxic elements of my own family, only to be handed the keys to a kingdom built on the secrets of 100 other dynasties. The gardener had become the apex predator of the boardroom. That conversation took place 5 years ago. Gregory Pierce was quietly investigated, indicted, and removed from the financial sector. Elias recovered and moved to a quiet estate in Napa Valley, spending his days advising me from a distance while tending to his own vineyard. I absorbed his firm, restructuring it to prioritize ethical investments and environmental conservation. I sit at my desk today looking out the window of my restored Carmel nursery. The rain has passed. The California sun is bright and warm, illuminating the endless rows of native coastal scrub and towering cypress trees we have propagated. My business thrives. The conservatory stands firm against the ocean wind. I reach into the bottom drawer of my desk. I pull out a small locked mahogany box. I turn the brass key and lift the lid. Resting inside is the original yellow envelope. The paper is soft with age. The edges are frayed. I trace the tight slanted handwriting of my grandmother Evelyn. The 10-digit phone number is faded, but the weight of what those numbers unlocked remains heavy and real. I look down at the envelope, and then I look straight ahead. If you are listening to this and you find yourself sitting at a table where your own family hands you a crumpled lottery ticket or a blank envelope while they toast to their own millions, let them laugh. Let them exchange their smug glances. Let them think you are small, invisible, and defeated. The most dangerous thing you can do in a room full of arrogant people is to remain silent and take notes. I learned how to survive from a woman who built an empire and a man who guarded its gates. I refined those lessons in the dirt of this nursery. If you ever find yourself surrounded by people who view you as prey, I want you to remember 3 rules. 1. Never interrupt an enemy when they are destroying themselves. Greed is a highly efficient executioner. Just step back and let them swing the axe. 2. Do not let people who measure worth in dollars tell you what you are worth in character. The dirt under your fingernails is proof of your labor. Their pristine hands are only proof of their privilege. And 3. When the time comes to checkmate them, do it with paper, not emotion. Tears evaporate. Shouting fades into the wind. But a signed contract, a forensic audit, and an ironclad boundary will stand forever. I smile, looking out over the blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The water is calm today. The tide is rolling in, washing away the footprints on the shore, steady and inevitable. I drop the yellow envelope back into the small memory box. I close the lid. I lock the drawer of my desk, and I walk out into the California sun entirely free.